The courtroom buzzed with an unsettling energy, the air thick with the whispers of those who had gathered for the trial. The day had finally arrived, the trial of David Johnson, a black man accused of a crime he didn't commit. Yet, as the proceedings began, there was an undercurrent of tension far beyond the usual weight of a court trial. Everyone could feel it, the injustice hanging over this case like a dark cloud. David sat at the defendant's table, his face a mask of calm determination, though inside, his heart pounded in his chest. This was it. His life had been turned upside down by an accusation as flimsy as a paper bag, but the damage it had caused to his reputation, his career, and his sense of security had already been done. He was innocent. He knew that. But here, in this courtroom, his fate would be decided by the very people who had already judged him for the color of his skin. At the front of the room, Judge Veronica Hayes sat on her elevated bench, her gaze cold and calculating. Known for her sharp tongue and unwavering sense of superiority, Judge Hayes had a reputation for being tough, unyielding, and often blatantly biased. There were rumors, some whispers in the halls, that she held prejudiced views, particularly when it came to cases involving black defendants. But no one ever dared to speak those words aloud, and no one had dared to challenge her. Until now. As David's lawyer, Emily Parker, stood and addressed the court, David could feel the weight of Judge Hayes's gaze bearing down on him. Emily was a young, passionate attorney with a sharp mind and a heart for justice. But even she seemed to be struggling under the pressure of this case. Her voice was steady, but there was a slight tremor in her hands as she flipped through her notes. Your Honor, we respectfully request that the court reconsider the evidence submitted by the prosecution, Emily began, her voice unwavering. The circumstances surrounding my client's arrest were deeply flawed, and the evidence against him is circumstantial at best. Judge Hayes glanced down at her papers, her lips curling into a thin, condescending smile. Ms. Parker, I appreciate your enthusiasm, but let's not waste any more of the court's time with your theatrics, she said, her tone dripping with disdain. We have a case to resolve here, not a charity event. Mr. Johnson is charged with stealing from a local business. The evidence is clear. Let's not pretend otherwise. David clenched his fists at his sides, fighting the urge to stand up and shout. He could feel the anger rising within him, but he knew he had to stay calm. Emily gave him a brief, reassuring glance before turning back to the judge. Your Honor, we're not here to waste anyone's time. We're here to seek justice. And justice demands a thorough examination of the facts, not a rush to judgment, Emily replied, her voice firm but respectful. Judge Hayes's expression hardened. I'm well aware of the importance of justice, Ms. Parker. But I'm also aware of the importance of efficiency. This isn't a case that needs to be dragged out. We have enough to move forward. David's breath caught in his throat. The arrogance in Judge Hayes's words was suffocating, but what was worse was the way she seemed to dismiss him, as if he were a mere afterthought in the grand scheme of the trial. Perhaps we should proceed, the judge continued, flipping her gavel in a sharp motion. Mr. Johnson, please rise and present your defense. Or shall we move on to the next case? David stood slowly, feeling the eyes of everyone in the room on him. His hands shook slightly, but he steadied himself. This was his moment. He wasn't going to let this woman, or anyone else, define him. He knew what he had to do. With a deep breath, he began, his voice calm and steady. Your Honor, I am innocent. I did not commit the crime I'm accused of. I've worked hard all my life to build a reputation, to be someone my family can be proud of. And yet, I stand here, accused of something that I did not do, simply because of the color of my skin. The room fell silent. David's words hung in the air like a challenge, daring anyone to dismiss him. Judge Hayes's lips twisted into an amused smile, and she leaned forward slightly. You're claiming your innocence, Mr. Johnson. How convenient, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. But the facts are clear. The evidence against you is irrefutable. You were caught on camera. The store clerk identified you. There's no escaping the truth. David's heart sank, but he refused to let it show. He had expected this, Judge Hayes's dismissiveness, her quickness to disregard anything that didn't fit her narrow view of the world. But he wasn't going to back down. "I didn't do it," he said firmly, looking her directly in the eyes. "And I'll prove it." Judge Hayes chuckled softly, clearly unimpressed. "Prove it? We'll see about that, Mr. Johnson. But for now, you're free to sit down." As David returned to his seat, he could feel the weight of the judge's scorn pressing down on him. He glanced over at Emily, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. She would fight for him, he knew that. But even she seemed to feel the oppressive force of the courtroom. The trial continued, and the minutes dragged on like hours. Each time David stood to speak, Judge Hayes's disdain was palpable. Her comments were sharp, her interruptions frequent. The rest of the courtroom seemed to follow her lead, with many members of the jury appearing visibly disinterested or outright dismissive. David couldn't help but wonder, was this the way it would always be? Would he always be judged based on his race rather than his character? Would the court always tilt in favor of those who held power? He wanted to believe that things could be different. But with every passing moment, it felt as though the system was working against him. The day's proceedings finally came to an end, but David didn't feel relief. The damage had been done. Judge Hayes had made it clear she wasn't interested in hearing his side of the story. She had already made up her mind about him, and it felt as though the rest of the world had too. As the courtroom emptied, David found himself alone with Emily and Michael, his estranged father, who had just returned to his life after years of separation. Michael, a former lawyer himself, had offered to help David with the case, though their relationship was still fractured. But right now, David needed him more than ever. "Don't let her get to you, son," Michael said softly, placing a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. "We've got this. We'll fight for your innocence. You're not alone in this." David nodded, grateful for his father's words but still haunted by the judge's harshness. As he walked out of the courtroom, his mind raced with thoughts of what lay ahead. He wasn't sure how they would win this battle, but one thing was certain, he was going to fight with everything he had. This was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? David Johnson had always known the weight of the world was heavier for him than it was for others. Growing up on the south side of Chicago, he learned early on that the color of his skin would be both a blessing and a curse. His family, while poor, was tight-knit, and they held on to each other fiercely, even as the world around them tried to tear them apart. David's father, Michael, had been a strong and confident man in his prime. He was a lawyer who believed in justice and fairness, qualities he instilled in David from a young age. But when David was just 8 years old, Michael had walked out of their lives. The reasons were never fully explained, but David often wondered if it was because the world was too heavy for his father to bear. He wasn't sure if it was a midlife crisis or something deeper, something that would only come into clearer focus years later. David's mother, Clara, was the rock of their family. Despite working long hours as a nurse, she always made time for David and his older sister, Michelle. She was strong and resilient, never showing weakness in front of her children. But David could see it in her eyes, the toll of raising 2 kids on her own, juggling work and home life, while silently battling the weight of systemic racism that was always just a step behind. "You can be anything you want, David," Clara would tell him when he was younger, wiping sweat from her brow after long shifts at the hospital. "But you have to work harder than anyone else. You have to prove them wrong." David never forgot those words. They became his mantra. He pushed himself through school, always the top student, always striving for excellence in a world that told him he didn't belong. His friends had a different reality, one that seemed free of the constant struggles he faced. They didn't know what it was like to be questioned simply because of how you looked. To have doors closed in your face just because you didn't fit the mold. But David kept his head up. He earned a scholarship to college, despite the odds stacked against him. He studied business and graduated with honors. And, with an incredible sense of pride, he landed a position at a prestigious firm, far above where anyone from his neighborhood expected him to go. He had made it. Or so he thought. But as David sat in the courtroom today, he realized how naive he had been. All those years of hard work, of trying to prove himself, hadn't changed anything. When the police came to arrest him, it was as if his accomplishments meant nothing. His success, his education, and his reputation were irrelevant. All that mattered was the skin he was born into. And no matter how much he tried to rise above it, the system had a way of pulling him back down. As he sat in his lawyer's office after the hearing, he looked at the photograph on the wall. It was a picture of him at his graduation, dressed in cap and gown, surrounded by classmates who didn't fully understand his struggles. David had been proud that day. His mother had wept in the front row, and even though his father wasn't there, David could feel him in his heart. But now, that picture seemed like a distant memory. David felt as if he were slipping backward, back into a world where he was just another black man facing the relentless weight of a broken system. "I just don't get it," David said, his voice low, as he sat across from Emily, his defense attorney. "I worked my entire life for this. I did everything right. But it's like none of it matters. None of it." Emily leaned forward, her brow furrowed with concern. She was still trying to process the enormity of the case they were up against, but her instincts told her that David's story wasn't just about a robbery gone wrong. It was about a larger fight, a battle against something far more insidious than any one person could fight alone. "You're right," Emily said, her voice gentle but firm. "The system is broken. It's been broken for a long time. But that doesn't mean you don't matter, David. Your story matters. And we're going to make sure the jury hears it." David shook his head, his frustration growing. "What if they don't? What if they just look at me and see another criminal, another statistic?" Emily reached out, placing a reassuring hand on his arm. "That's what we're going to fight. We're going to make sure they see you, David Johnson, the man, not just the label they've put on you." David didn't answer immediately. His thoughts drifted back to his family, especially his mother. Clara had always been his biggest supporter, the one who had always believed in him. She had been through so much, yet she never stopped pushing him to be better. And now, when he was facing the most difficult challenge of his life, she was still there, on the other end of the phone, offering words of encouragement. "Do you remember when my mom used to say that thing about fighting back?" David asked, his voice thick with emotion. "She said it was the only way to get ahead, that you had to fight to be seen as something more than your circumstances." Emily nodded, her expression softening. "Yes, I remember you telling me that." David took a deep breath, trying to steady his thoughts. "I just feel like I've been fighting all my life. I did everything they said I should do. And now, I'm still stuck in the same place, still facing the same fight. I don't know how much more I can take." His voice wavered, and for a moment, it felt like all the years of struggling and striving were catching up to him. It wasn't just the trial. It was the exhaustion of a lifetime of feeling overlooked and underestimated. It was the loneliness of fighting for a system that never truly fought for him in return. "You don't have to do it alone," Emily said, her voice firm but caring. "You've got me. And your family. You've got people who believe in you. Don't forget that." David nodded slowly, grateful for her words, but it still didn't erase the gnawing fear deep inside. What if this wasn't enough? What if, in the end, the system was too powerful for him to break free from? That night, David sat in his apartment, looking out over the city skyline. The lights of Chicago seemed so far away, like a world he no longer belonged to. He thought about his mother, about Michelle, about the world that had shaped him into the man he was today. And in that moment, he realized something: he wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for everyone who had been left behind, everyone who had been judged before they were ever given a chance. David wasn't just going to win this case. He was going to change the way people saw him, and, hopefully, the way they saw people like him. The day after the trial had ended, David felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. He had made it through the first round of hearings, but deep down, he knew this was just the beginning. His fight for freedom was only starting, and there was still so much more at stake. Emily Parker, his lawyer, had spent the night reviewing evidence and preparing for the next phase of the trial. The prosecutor was relentless, and Judge Veronica Hayes's apparent bias toward the prosecution made it even harder to see a way out. David couldn't shake the feeling that no matter what they did, the system was stacked against him. But Emily was determined. As they sat across from each other in her office the next morning, she laid out the next steps. "We've got to dig deeper, David. If we can find even the smallest shred of doubt, we can use it. The prosecution is focused on the surveillance footage, but there's more to this case than just that." David nodded, listening intently. Emily had been more than just a lawyer, she had become his confidant. Despite the long nights and the frustration, she never gave up. The fire in her eyes showed that she was just as committed to his innocence as he was. "You think there's something else?" David asked, his voice tinged with both hope and skepticism. "I do," Emily replied, her tone serious. "We need to find inconsistencies in the evidence, witness testimony, anything that doesn't line up. There are always cracks in the case, no matter how solid it seems. We just have to find them." David's thoughts immediately went to the key piece of evidence, the security footage that allegedly showed him robbing a local convenience store. His face had been partially obscured, but the prosecution insisted it was him. There had been no physical evidence tying him directly to the crime, but the visual evidence seemed damning. "I'll do whatever it takes," David said, his voice steady now. "I won't just sit back and let this happen." Emily nodded, her gaze firm. "We're in this together. But right now, I need you to trust me. I'm going to work with our investigator, Tom, to go through the security footage frame by frame. We need to see if we can uncover anything the prosecution missed." David leaned back in his chair, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find a way out of this. But at the same time, he couldn't shake the feeling that there were other forces at work, forces far beyond the courtroom, pulling the strings. As Emily made the arrangements with Tom, David walked out of her office and stepped into the city streets. The chill of the morning air bit at his skin, but he barely noticed. His mind was racing. He had to be careful. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes. The streets of Chicago were bustling, but David walked with purpose. He passed the familiar landmarks of his childhood, the corner store where he had bought candy as a kid, the church where he had once attended Sunday services with his mother. Everything looked the same, but he felt like he was seeing it all through a different lens now. The city that had once been his home seemed foreign, like a place that didn't want him anymore. As he walked, he couldn't help but think of his father, Michael. The man who had walked out of his life when he needed him most. The man who had preached about fighting for justice, but who hadn't been there when David needed him to stand up for him. David had tried to reach out to his father after he learned about the charges, but Michael hadn't returned his calls. There was a time when David would have given anything to have his father by his side. But now, his anger was mixing with the hurt. Why hadn't Michael stepped up for him? Had he been too busy with his own life to care? Or was there something else? Something David didn't know. Suddenly, David's phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Emily. "We've got something. Meet me at the office ASAP." David's heart skipped a beat. This was it. Whatever Emily had uncovered could change everything. He quickly turned and made his way back to her office, his steps quickening with each passing second. Back at Emily's office, David found her sitting at her desk, her eyes focused on her computer screen. Tom, the private investigator they had hired, was sitting next to her, scrolling through the footage on his tablet. "David," Emily said, standing up as he entered, "we've found something." Take a look at this. David moved closer to the desk, his eyes fixed on the screen. The footage showed a grainy, black and white image of the convenience store. It was the moment the robbery was supposed to have taken place, but as they played the footage frame by frame, something caught David's attention. There was a figure standing near the door, but in the second frame, a shadow moved in the background, something that hadn't been noticed before. It was subtle, but it was there. David pointed to the screen. "Wait, what is that? Who's that?" Emily paused the video, her finger hovering over the screen. "It's hard to tell, but it looks like someone else was in the store at the same time. It could be the person who committed the robbery." Tom leaned forward, squinting at the image. "I've enhanced the footage a bit. This person wasn't noticed by the police because they were focused on the figure near the counter, which they thought was you." David's heart pounded. This could be it. This could be the break they needed. "What's next?" Emily turned to him, her expression serious. "We need to find out who this person is. If we can identify them, we can prove you were not the one committing the crime." David exhaled sharply, a mixture of relief and dread flooding through him. They had found something, but this could open up a whole new set of challenges. What if this person was dangerous? What if they knew things about David that could put him in even greater peril? But right now, he didn't have a choice. He had to follow this lead. This was his chance to clear his name, to prove that he wasn't just another black man wrongfully accused. David stood up, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what the next steps would be, but he was certain of one thing: this wasn't over. He was ready to fight back, to show everyone that he was more than the label society had placed on him. Emily and Tom exchanged a look, then nodded. They were all in this together. The next few days blurred into a whirlwind of activity. Emily and Tom worked relentlessly, digging through the store's surveillance footage and reaching out to local contacts in an attempt to identify the mysterious figure in the background. Meanwhile, David tried to maintain his composure, though every moment seemed like a countdown to the trial. He knew he had to stay focused, but the tension gnawed at him like a constant presence. It wasn't just the looming threat of prison time that haunted him, it was the deeper feeling that he was somehow trapped in a system designed to keep people like him down. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how long this battle had been going on, long before this robbery charge had ever been brought against him. It was a war that had been waged every time he was passed over for a job because of his skin color, every time he was pulled over by the police for no reason, every time he was told he had to work harder than everyone else just to be seen as equal. But now, as the investigation into the robbery deepened, David began to see a glimmer of hope. If they could prove his innocence, maybe he could change the way people saw him. Maybe he could finally break free of the invisible chains that had held him back his entire life. As he sat in his small apartment, staring at his phone screen, a new message popped up from Emily. "We've found something. Come to the office, now." David's heart skipped a beat. Could this be it? Could they finally have identified the stranger in the footage? He grabbed his jacket, slipped on his shoes, and headed out the door. The air outside was crisp, the city buzzing with its usual energy, but David barely noticed. His mind was racing, his thoughts consumed by what might lie ahead. At Emily's office, Tom was already there, seated at the conference table, his tablet in hand. Emily stood by the window, her back to David as she gazed out at the skyline. She turned when she heard him enter, and the expression on her face was one of cautious optimism. "David," Emily said as she gestured for him to take a seat, "we've made some progress, but it's not exactly what we expected." David sat down, his heart pounding. "What do you mean? Have we found out who that person is?" Emily nodded, though her eyes were tinged with uncertainty. "Sort of. We have a name. But it's not someone we anticipated." David leaned forward, his mind racing. "Who is it?" Tom spoke up, his voice low but steady. "We ran the image through several databases, hoping to find a match. What we came up with was unsettling. The person on the footage is a known criminal. His name is Marcus Hill. David frowned. Marcus Hill. That name doesn't sound familiar. Emily continued, her tone serious. Hill has a history of robberies. He's been in and out of prison for most of his adult life. But here's the thing, he's not just any criminal. He's tied to a gang that's been operating in this area for years. And that's where things get complicated. David blinked, trying to process the information. Are you saying this guy is part of some gang? And we're somehow connected to him? Not exactly, Tom said, tapping the screen of his tablet. What we've uncovered is that Marcus Hill had been working with a larger criminal network, and this particular robbery might have been part of a bigger operation. We don't have all the details yet, but it looks like your case might be tied to something much bigger than just an isolated crime. David's stomach tightened. This was not what he expected. The revelation that the robbery might have been part of a larger scheme sent a chill down his spine. If Marcus Hill and his gang were involved, this could make everything even more dangerous. Not just for David's case, but for his life. How does this help me, though? David asked, trying to steady his nerves. If this Marcus guy is the one who did it, what does it mean for my trial? Emily exhaled slowly, sitting down across from him. That's the tricky part. The prosecution is going to argue that the footage shows you. They're going to claim you were just one of many people involved in this robbery, and that the gang connection doesn't matter. But it does matter, David interjected, frustration building. It shows I wasn't the one committing the crime. It shows I was framed. Emily held up her hand to calm him. I know. And we'll use that in court. But we need more. We need evidence that ties Hill directly to the crime. And we need to prove that you were nowhere near the scene when it happened. David sat back in his chair, thinking hard. I need to know more about Hill. Where is he now? Is he in custody? Emily and Tom exchanged a look. Emily spoke first. No, Hill isn't in custody. He's been off the radar for a while. But we have an address. We're planning to visit his known hangouts to see if we can find him or anyone who might know where he is. David stood up, pacing the room as he processed the information. He had been on edge from the start of this case, but now, with this new development, the stakes felt higher than ever. What if Hill found out that they were looking for him? What if he tried to retaliate? Do you think Hill will come after me? David asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily hesitated before answering. We can't rule it out. If he thinks you're involved or that you know too much, he could come after you. But right now, we have to focus on the case. If we can prove you had no connection to him, then the charges against you will be dropped. David nodded, but the fear still lingered in his chest. He had made it this far, but the closer they got to the truth, the more dangerous things seemed to get. He knew they had to keep pushing, but part of him wanted to back out. He didn't want to get dragged into a gang war. He didn't want to be a target. Let's go after Hill, David said finally, his voice resolute. I'm in. But I need to know we're doing this the right way. Emily smiled at him, a mixture of pride and relief in her eyes. We'll do this together, David. We're going to uncover the truth. And we're going to clear your name. As David left the office, his mind was a storm of conflicting emotions. He had taken a step closer to freedom, but that freedom might come at a price. The world around him seemed more uncertain than ever, and every decision felt like it could change everything. But there was one thing he knew for sure, he couldn't stop now. Not when the truth was so close. David had started this journey for justice, but now it felt like he was walking into a much larger fight. One that would test everything he had ever believed in. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was the only path left to him. The air was thick with tension as David sat in the back seat of Emily's car, staring out at the city that had both shaped and scarred him. They were on their way to Marcus Hill's last known address, a run-down apartment building in a forgotten part of Chicago. It was a place that most people avoided, a place where the shadows seemed to swallow anyone who dared to linger too long. Emily was driving, her expression focused as she navigated through the busy streets. Tom sat in the passenger seat, his fingers typing away on his phone, likely running background checks on any associates of Hill's. David wasn't sure what to expect when they reached Hill's hideout. The reality of the situation was starting to settle in, and it wasn't one he was particularly eager to confront. "What's the plan when we get there?" David asked, his voice tight with apprehension. Emily glanced in the rearview mirror, catching his eyes for a brief moment. "We're going to play it carefully. No direct confrontation. If we can find someone who knows where Hill is, we'll try to get as much information as we can without causing a scene. And if we can't find anyone?" David pressed, his heart rate picking up. He had no illusions about what might happen if they stumbled into trouble. "What then?" Tom spoke up, his voice low and deliberate. "If it comes down to it, we'll just have to leave and regroup. We're not equipped to handle any kind of altercation with people like Hill and his associates. We're here for intel, not a fight." David nodded, though he couldn't shake the unease gnawing at his insides. The stakes had never felt higher, and the closer they got to the truth, the more he realized how much was riding on this. If Hill was truly connected to the crime, it could mean his ticket out of this nightmare. But there was a darker side to all of this, the kind of danger he wasn't sure he was ready to face. As they neared the apartment complex, Emily slowed the car and turned onto a narrow street. The buildings around them were aged and worn, the windows broken or boarded up. The place looked abandoned, but David knew better. This was the kind of neighborhood that didn't show its secrets easily, the kind of place where people didn't ask questions unless they wanted to be silenced. "Here we are," Emily said quietly, pulling the car to a stop in front of a crumbling building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling off the walls, and graffiti tagged the sides like a silent testimony to the violence and decay that had taken root in this part of town. David felt a shiver run down his spine as they all stepped out of the car. The street was eerily quiet, but David could sense the weight of unseen eyes watching them from behind drawn curtains and broken windows. He'd been in neighborhoods like this before, but this time it felt different, more dangerous. His life wasn't just at risk because of the trial, now, it was about the people who were pulling the strings behind the scenes. "Stay close," Emily instructed, her voice steady but her eyes scanning their surroundings. "We'll check the building and see if anyone can point us in the right direction." Tom took out his phone again, his fingers moving rapidly over the screen. "I've got Hill's file here. I'm looking for any contacts, people who might know where he's hiding. If we find anyone, we get in, get the info, and get out." David swallowed hard. "Got it." They walked toward the entrance of the building, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the quiet. The door was half off its hinges, creaking as it swayed in the wind. Emily pushed it open with a firm shove, and the smell of dampness and decay hit David like a wall. The dim light that filtered through the broken windows barely illuminated the hallway, and the peeling wallpaper made the place feel like a haunted house. They moved cautiously, Emily leading the way, with Tom bringing up the rear. David's senses were on high alert, every sound and movement amplified in the silence. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, though he didn't see anyone. There was a feeling here that he couldn't explain, a sense of impending danger. "First floor," Emily said, her voice barely a whisper. "Let's check the mailboxes and see if there's anyone still living here." They approached the first set of mailboxes, but as Emily began to check them, David noticed something that made his stomach drop. A figure was standing at the end of the hall, half hidden in the shadows. For a moment, David's heart skipped a beat. Was it Hill? Or someone else? The figure didn't move, just stood there, watching them. A chill ran down David's spine, and every instinct in his body screamed to get out of there. But he knew they couldn't afford to leave without getting answers. Emily motioned for them to stay quiet, her hand instinctively reaching for the phone in her pocket, ready to call for help if necessary. But before she could move, the figure stepped forward into the dim light. David's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't Marcus Hill, but someone he recognized, a man he had seen around town, someone with a reputation. His name was Jalen, and he was known to be one of Hill's most trusted enforcers. Well, what do we have here? Jalen's voice was low, almost taunting. I don't suppose you're here for the neighborhood tour, are you? Emily didn't flinch, though David could feel the tension in the air between them. We're just looking for information, she said, her voice calm but firm. We don't want any trouble. Jalen smirked. Oh, you've got trouble now. Hill's been laying low, but you too. You're not the first to come sniffing around. And you won't be the last. David felt a sense of panic rising, but he kept his voice steady. We're just trying to find out where Hill is. We don't want any trouble. We just want answers. Jalen chuckled, his eyes scanning them like a predator sizing up his prey. Answers? You think you're going to get answers from me? Before David could respond, Jalen took a step forward, blocking their path. You're on the wrong side of this, my friend. And I don't think you know what you've gotten yourself into. Tom stepped forward then, his hand reaching for his phone. Listen, we're not here to fight. We're just looking for Hill. If you know where he is, it's in your best interest to tell us. Jalen raised an eyebrow, a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. And if I don't? David's heart pounded in his chest as he realized they had just walked into the lion's den. But it was too late to back out now. The air seemed to thicken with every passing second as Jalen's smirk deepened, his eyes glinting with something that sent a wave of unease through David's entire body. The tension was palpable, like the calm before a storm. Emily's posture was still poised, but David could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on her too. They were out of their depth here. Jalen stepped closer, his presence menacing. You think you can just walk into my turf and start asking questions? His voice had lowered to a threatening growl. This isn't some game. People disappear for less. David clenched his fists, doing his best to mask the fear rising within him. He couldn't let this man see how rattled he was, especially not when the stakes were so high. This wasn't just about his freedom anymore, it was about survival. We're not here to cause trouble, David said, his voice steady despite the storm churning in his chest. We just want to find Marcus Hill. We need to talk to him. That's all. Jalen's lips curled into a grin that was far too knowing. Hill. You think you can just waltz in and have a chat with him? That man doesn't make public appearances. He keeps to the shadows. And if you're looking for him here, you're wasting your time. Emily took a small step forward, her voice firm but measured. We know he's connected to the robbery. You're telling us he's not here, but you must know something. You're not the first person we've asked. Just give us something to work with, Jalen. The enforcer's eyes flicked between them, studying them like they were pieces on a chessboard. He leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. You're not in control here, sweetheart. I don't give out information for free. You want answers. You're going to have to make it worth my while. David felt a sharp pang of frustration at the man's words. They were running out of time, and every second they spent here was another second they were getting closer to being discovered by Hill or his crew. They had to play this right, whatever right meant in a situation like this. Make it worth your while. David repeated, trying to think through his options. What exactly do you want, Jalen? You know we're not the enemy here. We're just trying to figure this out. Jalen chuckled darkly, the sound echoing off the cracked walls of the hallway. You really think I care about what you're trying to figure out? I've been around too long to buy that. We're just trying to help act. You want answers, you better be ready to offer something in return. David exchanged a quick glance with Emily. He could tell she was working through the same dilemma. What could they offer this man? They didn't have money or connections, at least not ones that would matter to him. Their best bet, it seemed, was information. But what could they give him that would get them closer to Marcus Hill? What do you want, Jalen? David asked, his voice tight, knowing the answer might be something far worse than he could handle. Tell us, and we'll see what we can do. Jalen grinned wider, sensing their vulnerability. I want information too, he said, voice dripping with malice. I want to know who's been asking around about Hill. You think Hill's just going to sit back and let you sniff around without consequences? You're either with him, or you're against him. I want to know which side you're on. David's heart skipped a beat. This was the last thing they needed, being caught in the middle of Hill's gang war. The dangerous undertones of Jalen's words hung in the air like a dark cloud. They had to think fast. We're not involved in any of that, Emily spoke up quickly, her voice steady despite the tension. We just want to clear David's name. We're not on Hill's side. We're looking for the truth. You know this isn't about loyalty to a gang. It's about justice. Jalen stared at her, his eyes narrowing, then let out a low, guttural laugh. Justice? There's no such thing in this world, sweetheart. You don't want to be talking about justice when people like me and Hill are in control. You better start making deals if you want to walk out of here in one piece. David's chest tightened. He knew Emily was doing her best to handle this, but the reality was sinking in. They were outgunned, outmanned, and running out of options. He looked back at Tom, who had been silent up until now. Tom's face was drawn tight with worry, but his eyes were sharp, always looking for the next move. Jalen, David said, his voice quieter now, but laced with desperation. Look, we don't want trouble. But you have to know, if we don't get this information, we're just going to keep looking elsewhere. We're not stopping until we find Hill. So either we work together, or we're on different sides of this thing. Jalen gave a small nod, a calculating look in his eyes. You're not in control here, David. But, maybe you'll be useful. His smile was cold, the kind of smile that sent a chill down David's spine. He took a step back, nodding toward the stairwell. There's a guy up on the second floor who might know something. He's a runner for Hill. Doesn't talk much, but he's got connections. You might be able to get something out of him. But don't get cute. Hill's people are everywhere. And if I catch wind that you're playing me, I won't hesitate to make you regret it. Emily took a deep breath, her eyes flicking to David for a moment. Thank you, she said, her voice calm but carrying an edge of steel. We won't forget this. Jalen shrugged as if their gratitude meant nothing to him. You better not. Just remember, this is a dangerous game you're playing. With that, Jalen turned and disappeared into the shadows of the building, leaving David and the others in silence. The moment he was gone, Emily exhaled, her posture relaxing just a little. But David knew they weren't out of danger yet. Let's move, she said, gesturing for them to follow. We don't have much time. They moved up the staircase cautiously, every step feeling like a countdown. The building groaned and creaked as if it was alive, but the sounds only heightened the tension. David could feel his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Every second felt like an eternity. When they reached the second floor, the hallway was even darker than the one below. The faint light from a flickering bulb barely illuminated the space, and the oppressive silence only made everything feel worse. Emily knocked softly on a door near the end of the hall. No answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time. Still nothing. David's anxiety spiked as they stood there, waiting for a sign that they were going in the right direction. Finally, the door creaked open, and a man in his late 20s appeared, looking groggy but alert. He was dressed in a faded hoodie, his eyes darting between them suspiciously. The moment he saw them, his expression hardened. Who are you? He demanded, his voice low. We're looking for Marcus Hill, Emily said, her voice clear and direct. We need to speak with him. We were told you might know where he is. The man's eyes flicked to the side, and David caught a glimpse of something, fear. Guilt? It was hard to tell. But he knew they were close. And now, they just had to hope they could get the information they needed before things took a dangerous turn. The man in the doorway sized them up, his eyes flickering with suspicion. David could see the indecision in his posture, the way his body tensed and then relaxed, almost as though he was deciding whether or not to shut the door and pretend they weren't there. But before he could speak, Emily took a step forward, her tone firm but not threatening. "We're not here to cause trouble," she said. "We just need information. If you know where Marcus Hill is, we need to talk to him. It's important." The man hesitated for a moment, his gaze darting around as though searching for something, maybe a way out, or maybe a reason to trust them. Finally, he opened the door wider, stepping aside just enough to let them in. "Fine," he muttered. "Come in. But keep it quick." David exchanged a quick glance with Emily. They had no idea who this man was, or whether he was telling the truth about knowing where Hill was. But they had no other choice. They stepped inside. The room was small, sparsely furnished. A couch sat against one wall, its fabric worn and faded, and the only light came from a single lamp in the corner, casting long shadows across the room. The air was thick, stale with a mixture of sweat, cigarettes, and cheap liquor. It felt like the kind of place where people went to hide. "I'm Marcus," the man said, as if introducing himself should have meant something. "But you can call me M." David noted the tension in the way he spoke, like he was trying to distance himself from whatever mess they had walked into. It wasn't much of a name to go by, but it was better than nothing. He could feel Emily's eyes on him, waiting for him to take the lead. This was his mess to clean up, after all. "Marcus," David said, his voice steady but cautious. "We were told you might know something about Hill's whereabouts. We're trying to find him. This is urgent." The man's eyes narrowed slightly, and he leaned against the doorframe, folding his arms across his chest. "Why should I help you? What makes you think I even care where Hill is?" Emily stepped forward again, her gaze sharp. "Because it's not just about Hill. We're talking about something bigger. You know, this isn't just about a robbery or some random act of violence. Hill's involved in something dangerous, and people's lives are at stake. If you know anything, now's the time to speak up." There was a long silence. Marcus stared at them, his jaw clenched as if he were debating whether or not to let them in on whatever secret he was holding on to. Finally, he exhaled, his breath heavy and resigned. "I don't want any part of this," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But you're right. Hill's been tangled up in something bad. People are coming for him, and they're coming for anyone in his circle. If I tell you anything, it won't be because I want to help you. It's because I want to stay alive." David could feel his pulse quicken. This was it. This was the lead they had been hoping for. But he had to be careful, had to make sure they didn't push too hard or too fast. "Anything you can tell us will help," David said, his voice a little more urgent now. "Where is he? We need to find him before things get worse." Marcus looked over his shoulder nervously, as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. He pulled a chair out from the small table in the middle of the room and sat down, motioning for them to do the same. "You're not the only ones looking for Hill," Marcus continued. "There are people who've been tracking him for months, maybe longer. And it's not just law enforcement. There are others out there, private parties, who are way more dangerous than you or me. And they're not asking questions. They just want him, and they'll do whatever it takes to get him." "Who's looking for him?" Emily asked, her voice steady but sharp. "Who else is involved in this?" Marcus hesitated. He clearly didn't want to say too much, but the fear in his eyes was undeniable. "I don't know all the details," he said, running a hand through his hair. "But I do know that Hill crossed someone big. Someone with a lot of power. It's not just the robbery that's got people after him, there's something bigger at play. I don't know the whole story, but Hill's been moving around a lot, trying to lay low. I'm guessing that's why he hasn't been showing up in public. He knows he's a target now. David's mind raced. This was all getting more complicated by the minute. He'd thought Hill was just a low-level criminal who had gotten mixed up in the robbery. But now it seemed like he was tangled in something far darker and more dangerous. And David had been swept up into it, whether he liked it or not. Where is he now? David asked again, desperation creeping into his voice. Please, Marcus. We don't have much time. Marcus let out a deep sigh, clearly torn. I don't know exactly where he is, but I know he's been spending time in the industrial area by the docks. It's an old warehouse district, no one goes there unless they're trying to hide from something or someone. It's perfect for someone like Hill who's trying to stay off the radar. David's heart skipped a beat. This was it. This was the lead they needed. But as the words sank in, he realized the danger they were about to walk into. A dark, abandoned warehouse district. They would be walking straight into the heart of enemy territory, and they wouldn't be alone. Do you know which warehouse? Emily asked, her voice now serious and focused. Can you point us in the right direction? Marcus shook his head. I don't know which one specifically, but I can tell you one thing, don't go there alone. There are people who work for Hill, and they don't care who you are. If they see you snooping around, they won't hesitate to take care of you. David exchanged a glance with Emily. This was becoming more dangerous by the second. But they had no choice. They had to follow this lead, no matter the risks. Thank you, David said, trying to sound calm, though his mind was racing. We won't forget this. Marcus nodded slowly, his face a mask of resignation. Just remember, I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this because I want to stay breathing. As they turned to leave, Marcus added one last warning. And don't trust anyone else you meet out there. Hill's people are everywhere. If you get caught, there's no coming back from it. David swallowed hard. The weight of Marcus's words hung in the air, heavy with the gravity of the situation. They had no choice but to go to the docks, to the warehouses. But something told David that finding Hill was only the beginning. The real battle was about to begin. The night was thick with tension as David, Emily, and Tom made their way toward the industrial district. The streets grew quieter as they neared the edge of town, where the lights from the city gave way to the dark silhouette of the warehouses. The air smelled of salt from the nearby river, mixed with the stench of oil and metal that lingered in the abandoned area. David kept his head down, the weight of Marcus's warning hanging over him. Don't trust anyone out there. The words echoed in his mind with each step, amplifying the unease that had settled deep in his gut. They were heading into a hornet's nest, and he knew that if things went wrong, there would be no second chances. They had no plan, no clear idea of what they were walking into, but they couldn't afford to waste any more time. They had to find Marcus Hill, before anyone else did. We're close, Emily said, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but determined, as always. We should keep our distance from the warehouses. If Hill's people are here, they'll be watching. David nodded, scanning the area as they walked. The dimly lit streets were empty, the occasional stray dog wandering past or the faint sound of water lapping against the docks the only signs of life. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every alley a potential hiding spot for someone with bad intentions. We should split up, Tom suggested. That way, if someone notices us, we can cover more ground without raising too much suspicion. Emily shook her head. Splitting up is too risky. We don't know who or what we're dealing with here. Let's stay together. If we see anything suspicious, we stick to the plan, get in, get out, and don't make a scene. David agreed. The last thing they needed was to draw attention. Every step they took felt like they were walking into a lion's den, and the further they went, the more that sense of danger clawed at him. They reached the first row of warehouses. The buildings were tall and imposing, their metal exteriors rusted and worn from years of neglect. Many of the windows were boarded up or shattered, casting jagged, broken shadows on the ground. The silence was almost deafening. "Keep your eyes peeled," David muttered, his voice barely audible. "We're not alone here." They moved cautiously, staying close to the buildings to remain hidden from view. Emily led the way, her steps light and calculated, while Tom kept watch behind them. Every so often, they would pause to listen, straining to catch any sound that didn't belong. A distant car engine. The faint shuffle of footsteps. It was always just out of reach, but the tension in the air suggested they weren't the only ones here. As they rounded a corner, a small flicker of movement caught David's eye. His heart skipped a beat. A figure. Someone moving between two warehouses. "Did you see that?" David whispered urgently. Emily's eyes narrowed, and she signaled for them to stop. "Yeah. Stay quiet." The figure vanished behind the corner of the warehouse, and for a moment, the silence returned. The hairs on the back of David's neck stood on end as his mind raced. Was it one of Hill's people? Or just someone else in the area? They couldn't risk being discovered. Emily motioned for them to continue moving, carefully and quietly, toward the far side of the next warehouse. As they got closer, they could see the door to a large, rusted building slightly ajar. The dim light from the interior spilled into the night, casting long shadows across the ground. "This is it," Emily whispered, her voice tense. "We need to go in." David's heart pounded in his chest. Everything in him screamed to turn back, to abandon this reckless search for Hill before things got any worse. But they had come too far to turn back now. He nodded. "Let's do it." They approached the door cautiously, their footsteps muffled by the worn concrete beneath them. As they reached the entrance, they paused. The door creaked softly, its rusty hinges protesting against the disturbance. David held his breath, straining to listen for any sign of movement inside. Nothing. "On three," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper. 1, 2, 3. She pushed the door open, just enough for them to slip inside. The warehouse was vast, stretching out in all directions, filled with the smell of old wood and oil. A few dim lights flickered overhead, casting an eerie glow on the shelves and crates scattered around the room. They slipped inside, keeping close to the shadows. The silence was thick, but David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. He could hear the faint sound of muffled voices somewhere deep within the building, too far to make out any words, but close enough to make his skin crawl. "Stay low," Emily murmured. "Let's find a way to get to the back. If Hill's here, he's not going to be out in the open." They crept forward, moving past stacks of old crates and abandoned machinery. The building was a maze of forgotten goods and broken-down equipment. The further they went, the darker it got. The only sounds now were their soft footsteps and the occasional groan of the building settling around them. David's pulse quickened as they reached the far side of the warehouse. There was a large office at the back, the door slightly ajar, the faintest glow of light spilling out from within. "That's it," Tom whispered. "That's where the voices are coming from." Emily gave a quick nod. "We need to be careful. There might be more of Hill's men inside." They approached the office slowly, inching their way toward the door. David's breath came in short bursts, his mind racing with the possibility of what they might find on the other side. Were they about to walk into a trap? Was Hill even there? Or was this just another dead end? Before they could get any closer, a sudden noise made them freeze. A door creaked open in the distance, followed by the sound of footsteps approaching rapidly. Someone was coming. "Get down," Emily hissed, pulling them into the nearest shadow. They crouched behind a pile of crates, holding their breath, listening as the footsteps drew nearer. The figure appeared in the doorway, but he didn't see them. David could barely make out the silhouette of a tall man, dressed in black, his features obscured by the shadows. The man stopped in the middle of the warehouse, scanning the area. David's heart hammered in his chest, and he could feel his palms growing slick with sweat. The man took a few steps forward, then stopped again, looking directly at the pile of crates where they were hiding. For a long, agonizing moment, time seemed to freeze. David could hear his own heartbeat in his ears, louder than the footsteps or the sounds of the warehouse. He squeezed his eyes shut for a brief second, willing himself not to make a sound. If they were caught here, it was over. And then, just as suddenly, the man turned and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. David exhaled sharply, feeling like he'd just dodged a bullet. He exchanged a glance with Emily, who gave a small, tense nod. "We move now," she whispered, her voice low and urgent. They didn't have much time. Hill was close, but so were the dangers. They had to make their move, and fast. The darkness in the warehouse seemed to press in on them as they moved quickly and quietly through the shadows. David's heart pounded in his chest, every footstep he took louder than it felt. They were getting closer. He could feel it. The tension was thick in the air, like a storm that was waiting to break, and he had a sinking feeling that their presence had already been detected. Emily's face was set in a determined mask, her eyes scanning every corner, every possible escape route. Tom was right behind them, his body tense, prepared for anything. David knew this was a dangerous game. They were walking into the lion's den, and they had no idea what awaited them at the other end. "Stay sharp," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "We need to find out where Hill is hiding. We don't know how many people are here, so don't get caught off guard." David nodded, swallowing hard. He had never been in a situation like this before, had never been so deep in the heart of danger. But the urgency of finding Marcus Hill drove him forward. They had to stop whatever was coming before it was too late. They reached the office at the back of the warehouse. The door was still slightly ajar, just as it had been moments before, and David could hear the low hum of voices inside. They were close. They had to be. Emily signaled for them to stop. She crouched low, pressing her back to the wall, and motioned for them to follow suit. "We're going in, but we need to be quick," she whispered. David felt his chest tighten as he crouched beside her, peering through the narrow crack in the door. His eyes scanned the room. There were two men sitting at a table, speaking in low tones. One of them had his back to the door, while the other faced toward it, his eyes flicking over paperwork spread out in front of him. The man facing them looked vaguely familiar, though David couldn't place him immediately. But the moment his gaze flicked back to the other man, something clicked in his mind. He had seen this man before. Marcus Hill. The face was older now, worn with the passage of time, but unmistakable. It was him. David's heart skipped a beat. Hill was right there in the room, less than 10 feet away. Emily motioned for them to move, and they silently slipped through the door, careful not to make any noise. The room smelled of stale coffee and dust. As they moved toward the center of the room, the two men continued their conversation, unaware of the trespassers in their midst. David stayed close to the wall, his eyes fixed on Hill. The older man didn't look like the dangerous criminal David had imagined. He seemed worn out, his once imposing presence now diminished by the weight of his choices. His eyes darted between the papers in front of him and the man across from him, but he didn't seem to notice the trio inching closer. They were almost there. "Now," Emily murmured, her voice just above a whisper. Without hesitation, they moved in. Emily approached Hill, stepping into his line of sight. The moment he looked up, his eyes widened in surprise, and he scrambled to his feet. "Who the hell are you?" Hill's voice was sharp, his hand instinctively reaching for something under the table. Before Hill could react further, David spoke, his voice calm but authoritative. "Marcus Hill. We're here for answers. We need to talk." Hill froze, his hand still hovering under the table. His eyes shifted between David, Emily, and Tom, as if weighing the situation, deciding whether to fight, flee, or listen. "What's this all about?" he growled, trying to regain his composure. "You don't just come into my hideout and ask questions." "We're not here to fight," Emily said, stepping forward slowly. "We're trying to stop a disaster." Your name's been tied to something bigger than a simple robbery. People are going to get hurt if we don't stop this. Hill's eyes flicked toward the door, as though considering making a run for it, but then he seemed to deflate, all the fight draining from him. He sat back down, rubbing his eyes with the back of his hand. You don't understand, he muttered, his voice suddenly much quieter. I've been trying to keep my head down. I didn't want to get tangled in this shit. But they don't give you a choice. They never give you a choice. Emily stepped forward, her voice firm. Who are they, Marcus? Who's pulling the strings here? Hill hesitated, glancing at the door again, then back at them. He seemed to be considering the risks of telling them the truth, but in the end, he must have realized he had nothing left to lose. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing as he spoke in a low, conspiratorial tone. They're a group, a network of people who, he stopped suddenly, eyes darting toward the door once more. The tension in the air thickened, and for a moment, David felt his own pulse quicken. Something wasn't right. Before anyone could react, the door to the office slammed open. A man in a black jacket and sunglasses stormed in, followed by two more men. The intruders moved with the speed and precision of well-trained professionals, their hands instinctively going to their weapons. Move, the man in front barked, his voice low and dangerous. Get down. David's heart jumped into his throat as the man reached for Hill, grabbing him by the collar and yanking him to his feet. The other two men turned their attention toward Emily, David, and Tom, their eyes hardening with suspicion. Get them out of here, the man ordered, throwing a glance in their direction. It all happened in an instant, too fast for them to react. The room filled with the cold weight of danger. David barely had time to process the situation before one of the men grabbed his arm, yanking him roughly toward the door. Let go of him. Emily shouted, but it was clear that the men were in control now. Her eyes locked onto David's for a brief, frantic moment, filled with a shared understanding that they were about to be dragged into something much deeper and far more dangerous than they had imagined. The man with the sunglasses yanked Hill toward the door, his grip like iron. We have to move now, he growled, his voice carrying a menacing finality. It's time to leave, Marcus. You're not in control anymore. As they were forced out of the office and into the dimly lit hallway, David's mind raced. The network, the people behind this, it was all becoming clearer now, but the question was, could they stop it before it was too late? David's breath came in ragged gasps as the men pushed them through the darkened corridors of the warehouse. Every step felt like it was echoing through his chest, the pounding of his heart drowning out everything else. He glanced back at Emily and Tom, their faces pale but resolute. The men were moving with swift precision, guiding them deeper into the bowels of the warehouse, and David couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into the heart of something far worse than they'd bargained for. They passed rows of forgotten crates, the cold air growing more oppressive as they moved. The men with sunglasses and black jackets were silent, their eyes flicking between the trio, watching them like hawks. David could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They had come looking for answers, but now they were being herded like cattle into a trap. They were out of their depth. I thought you said you didn't want trouble, Emily whispered under her breath, her voice tight with suppressed fear. This is bad, David. We're not dealing with just Hill. David's lips tightened. I know. I don't know what's going on here, but we need to stay calm. We'll find a way out. They came to a large, open space at the back of the warehouse, lit only by the faint glow of a few overhead lights. The walls were lined with steel doors, each one marked with faded numbers, and the air smelled of damp concrete and oil. At the far end of the room, a tall man stood by a desk, his back to them. He was dressed in a dark suit, his posture rigid, as though he was waiting for something, or someone. The lead man with the sunglasses shoved Hill forward roughly, making the older man stumble before regaining his balance. We've got company, the lead man said, his voice low and devoid of emotion. The man at the desk turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as he took in the newcomers. There was something cold and calculating in his gaze. He stepped forward, his polished shoes clicking on the concrete floor. "Well, well, well," the man said, his voice smooth, almost mockingly. "What do we have here?" Marcus Hill and his guests. David's stomach twisted. This wasn't just a run-of-the-mill criminal operation. This was something far more organized, far more dangerous. "Who the hell are you?" Hill rasped, his voice hoarse. "What do you want with me?" The man's lips curled into a smile, but it was anything but friendly. "I think you know exactly who I am, Marcus," he said, his eyes flicking to the three of them. "I don't take kindly to people snooping around where they don't belong." David felt a shiver run down his spine as the man's gaze shifted toward him and the others. His eyes were calculating, sharp, and David knew in that moment that he was no longer in control. They were in the presence of someone who didn't care about right or wrong. He only cared about power. "Are these the people who have been poking around?" the man asked, his voice like steel. His gaze turned back to Hill, and there was a cruel edge to his words. "You've been sloppy, Marcus. But that's not my problem, is it?" Hill's face twisted with regret, and for the first time, David saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. "I didn't want any part of this," Hill muttered. "I just wanted out." The man at the desk stepped forward, his eyes locking onto David. "You're not going anywhere," he said coldly. "Not until I get what I want." David could feel the tension in the air thicken. The man's words hung heavily in the room, like a threat that was just waiting to be acted upon. He knew they were in over their heads now. This wasn't just a criminal operation. This was something bigger. Something that could ruin everything. "What do you want with us?" Emily asked, her voice steady despite the fear that was clearly gripping her. She was trying to keep control of the situation, but even she could tell that their options were limited. The man smiled again, but this time, it was even colder. "You're in the wrong place at the wrong time," he said slowly. "And now, you're going to learn what happens when you meddle in things you don't understand." David's mind raced. He had to think of something, some way to escape, but the situation was closing in on them fast. The lead men flanked them on either side, their expressions unreadable. There was no easy way out. Suddenly, Hill spoke again, his voice trembling. "I never wanted this. I never wanted to be part of their games." The man at the desk didn't seem to care. "You've made your bed, Marcus," he said, his tone cold. "And now you'll lie in it. You all will." David's heart pounded in his chest. This was bad. They were all about to be caught in something far worse than they had imagined. But there had to be a way out. There had to be a chance. Then, as if fate itself had decided to intervene, the warehouse lights flickered. A low hum vibrated through the room, and for a moment, everything went dark. It was only for a second, but in that moment, the atmosphere shifted. David's instincts kicked in. The second the lights flickered, he shoved Emily and Tom to the ground, grabbing Hill by the arm and yanking him down with them. "Down!" David shouted, the urgency in his voice cutting through the air. He couldn't explain it, but he felt something, a shift in the energy of the room. Something was about to happen. They had to take advantage of the moment. The sound of the door behind them exploded open with a crash, and for a brief, surreal moment, David thought he heard gunshots. The next thing he knew, the warehouse was filled with chaos. Men in dark suits and balaclavas stormed into the room, shouting orders. A firefight broke out almost instantly, the sound of gunfire ringing through the air. David's heart raced as he pushed himself off the ground, grabbing Hill by the arm and pulling him toward the chaos. "Stay down!" Emily yelled, her voice barely audible over the deafening noise. Tom was already on his feet, scanning the room for any kind of exit. David's mind was spinning, but his body was moving on instinct. The world around him was a blur of motion, danger, and fear. He couldn't let this opportunity slip away. The man in the suit was shouting now, his voice panicked, ordering his men to fight back, but it was clear they were outnumbered. David could see the look of terror in his eyes as the scene unfolded around him. As they raced toward the exit, David grabbed Emily's arm, pulling her forward. "We need to move now," he shouted. There was no time to question what was happening or who the new players were. They had to get out. But as they reached the door, one of the masked men blocked their path. His weapon was aimed straight at them. "You're not leaving," he growled, his finger tightening on the trigger. Before David could react, another gunshot rang out from behind him, striking the man in the chest. He fell to the ground with a thud, and the warehouse doors slammed shut with a deafening bang. The gunshot echoed in David's ears, and his heart hammered in his chest. For a brief, surreal moment, everything seemed to slow. The masked man crumpled to the ground in front of them, his weapon slipping from his grasp. Blood pooled on the concrete, the sound of it dripping like a grim reminder of how close they were to death. David didn't stop moving. The shock of the moment hit him, but instinct overpowered it. He grabbed Emily and Tom by the arms, dragging them toward the exit. There was no time to process what had just happened. They had to escape, now. The warehouse doors had been slammed shut, and the distant sounds of chaos continued to reverberate behind them. The firelight from the distant shooting flickered across the walls, casting strange shadows that danced with every step they took. David's breathing was fast, his mind racing. Who were these new people? And why had they come to their rescue, or had they? Emily was the first to snap out of the daze. She yanked her arm free from David's grip, her eyes darting around the room. "We need to move, and we need to move fast," she said urgently. That was no coincidence. "They're coming for us next." David nodded, not daring to look back. His gaze was locked forward, scanning the hallway for any sign of an exit. They needed to get out of the warehouse and figure out what was happening, but that wasn't going to be easy. Tom, always the level-headed one in a crisis, tugged at David's sleeve. "We can't just rush out there blindly. We need to figure out who the hell those people were and why they shot that guy." He looked around, his face pale. And what the hell just happened back there? David couldn't shake the feeling that they had just walked into something far deeper and more dangerous than they could have imagined. Who had fired that shot? And why had they suddenly come to their aid? They had no idea who the new players were, but it was clear that whatever game they were playing was deadly. "Let's get out of here first, then we'll figure it out," David said, his voice low. He didn't want to risk losing this narrow window of opportunity. They had to get as far from the warehouse as possible before more trouble found them. Emily and Tom fell into step with him, their faces tense, their movements quick but deliberate. They turned a corner into another corridor, heading toward what looked like an emergency exit at the far end. The sound of gunfire had stopped, but the tension in the air remained. "We have to be careful," Emily warned. "That guy we just saw, the one at the desk, he didn't seem like an ordinary criminal. He's got connections. And those men who just shot that guy. They didn't look like amateurs either. Someone's going to be coming for us, whether we like it or not." David's thoughts were a whirlwind, but one thing was clear, they weren't safe yet. Not by a long shot. The emergency exit was only a few steps away, but as they neared it, a loud bang sounded from behind them. The door to the hallway they'd just come from flew open, and a new wave of men in tactical gear spilled into the corridor. Their faces were obscured by black masks, but their presence was undeniable. They were here for one thing, and it wasn't to ask questions. David felt his pulse spike. He had a split second to make a choice. They could either stand and fight, or they could try to escape through the emergency exit and hope for the best. "Go," he shouted, not giving them a chance to hesitate. They sprinted toward the door, their footsteps muffled by the adrenaline coursing through their veins. As David grabbed the handle and yanked it open, a blinding light hit them, temporarily disorienting him. They had made it outside, but there was no safe haven waiting for them. The parking lot in front of the warehouse was desolate, a few cars scattered here and there under the flickering streetlights. But it wasn't empty for long. A black SUV roared into the lot, its tires screeching against the pavement. The headlights blinded them for a moment, and David's stomach dropped. The car came to a skidding halt, and the doors flew open. More men in dark clothing stepped out, their eyes scanning the surroundings. "This is getting out of hand," Emily muttered. Her voice was steady, but David could tell she was just as rattled as he was. "We need to make a decision." David clenched his jaw, weighing his options. The new arrivals weren't backing down. There was nowhere to run, and the only way out was through. "We take the car," he said decisively. "We get in and we go. It's our only shot." The plan was risky, but there was no time for hesitation. David turned to Tom and Emily. "Stay close. I'll handle the driver." They moved quickly, their feet pounding against the pavement as they headed toward the black SUV. The men standing in front of it hadn't noticed them yet, still distracted by the chaos behind them. David reached the vehicle first, his fingers brushing the handle as he ripped open the door. The man in the driver's seat was just about to turn, but before he could react, David's fist slammed into his jaw, knocking him out cold. "Get in!" David shouted, jumping into the driver's seat. Emily and Tom didn't hesitate. They jumped into the back of the SUV, and within seconds, they were speeding away from the warehouse, tires squealing as they peeled out onto the main road. David's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror, expecting to see flashing lights or pursuing vehicles. But for the moment, they were free. "We're not out of the woods yet," Emily said, her voice tense as she looked over her shoulder. "They'll be after us. We can't trust anyone in this mess." David nodded grimly. "I know. But for now, we have a car, and we have a head start. Let's use it to our advantage." They raced through the streets, the dark city unfolding around them. But as the adrenaline began to wear off, the weight of their situation hit him full force. They had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but the fact that they were willing to shoot someone in broad daylight spoke volumes. And Hill. Marcus Hill was the key. David could feel it. Everything they had learned so far pointed back to him. The car sped through an intersection, and David glanced at the clock on the dashboard. It was almost midnight. They didn't have much time. "Where to?" Tom asked, his voice low. David took a deep breath, making a quick decision. "We need to find a safe house. Somewhere they can't track us. We need time to think and figure out what the hell is going on." Emily's eyes flickered with a hint of uncertainty, but she didn't argue. They had no choice. Time was running out. The web was tightening around them, and soon, the answers they were searching for would be revealed. But the truth was more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The SUV's tires screeched as David whipped around another corner, narrowly avoiding a pothole that threatened to send them careening off course. The city lights blurred past them, and the dark streets offered little solace. They were still too close to the warehouse, too close to the chaos they had barely escaped. The sound of their pulse pounding in his ears, David knew they needed to get out of the city, away from the chaos and into somewhere safe, at least for the time being. The streets became more desolate as they drove further from the center of town. The tall, oppressive buildings gave way to low-rises and faded industrial blocks. David slowed the car, scanning the area ahead. He had a place in mind, a safe house that was tucked away in the suburbs, off the grid and known only to a select few. As he turned onto a quieter street, Tom spoke up from the back seat, his voice breaking through the tension. "You really think this place will keep us safe? After what happened back there?" His words were laced with disbelief, but also a trace of fear. "You know they'll be coming after us, right?" David didn't answer immediately. His focus was on the road, his eyes darting from side to side, constantly checking for any signs of pursuit. After a few beats, he finally spoke, his voice steady but low. "They'll come. But we've got a head start. The safe house is secure. I trust the people who own it. No one will know where we are." Emily leaned forward from the back seat, her eyes scanning their surroundings. "If anyone knows who we are or what we're doing here, we're in even deeper trouble than we thought." "I don't think that's an issue yet," David said, trying to reassure her. "But if we stay in the city much longer, we're gonna stick out like a sore thumb." They reached a narrow alleyway that led to an old brick building, its exterior worn and battered by time. David slowed the car to a crawl and turned into the alley, the headlights illuminating a dilapidated, unmarked door at the back. He parked the SUV in the shadows, cutting the engine, and for a moment, the quiet felt unnerving. "We're here," David said, glancing at Emily and Tom. "Stay close. Don't talk unless we have to." The three of them stepped out of the SUV, and David led them to the back door. He knocked 3 times, quick, sharp raps, and waited. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing a middle-aged man with graying hair, wearing a dark jacket. His eyes narrowed when he saw David but softened when he saw the others. "David," the man said, his voice low but cordial. "I wasn't expecting you tonight." "Yeah, well, things have changed," David replied, keeping his voice even. "We need to lay low for a while." The man nodded, stepping aside to let them in. As they entered, the musty smell of old wood and dust greeted them, but the dim lighting and silence were almost a relief after the chaos they'd left behind. "Welcome to my humble abode," the man said, closing the door behind them and securing the lock. "You can all relax for now. You're safe here, for the time being." David didn't waste any time. He turned to the man. "We need your help, Jack. We've gotten ourselves tangled in something bad, and we have no idea how deep it goes." Jack raised an eyebrow. "Sounds like it's more than a simple run-in with some low-level thugs." "You have no idea," David muttered, running a hand through his hair. "But I need to know what's really going on. You've got connections, what can you find out?" Jack walked over to a table in the corner, sorting through papers and files that seemed as disorganized as the rest of the place. "You know I don't do favors for free," he said, his voice a bit rough around the edges. "But I'll help you out this time. Let's see what I can dig up. But you better hope you didn't just make enemies with someone you can't handle." David's stomach twisted, but he didn't let the fear show. "I don't think I have a choice." Emily, her expression tight with concern, spoke up. "How long will it take? We need answers, fast." Jack shot her a brief look before he nodded. "I'll get to work on it now. It's not gonna be easy, but I'll dig around. You all should rest. It's gonna be a long night." David glanced at Emily and Tom, who both looked just as exhausted as he felt. But rest wasn't an option. Not yet. They needed to figure out what to do next, and fast. "I'll take the first watch," David said, his voice firm. "Get some sleep, but stay alert." Emily nodded, though she clearly didn't trust the idea of resting when they were so close to danger. Tom, however, sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair in frustration. "Where do we even go from here, David?" he asked quietly, his voice tinged with worry. "We barely know what we're up against." David sat down across from him, his mind still racing. "We keep going. We figure out what Hill knows, why they're after him, and why they brought us into it. Then we take it from there." But even as he said the words, David wasn't sure if he believed them. This wasn't some small-time operation. Whoever was behind this, whoever had ordered those men to chase them down, was far more dangerous than anything they had anticipated. Hours passed. Jack kept to his work, moving around the room as he dug through old papers and typed furiously on a small laptop. David tried to sleep but couldn't. The adrenaline from the escape still pumped through his veins, keeping him alert, despite the exhaustion. Finally, just as the first rays of dawn began to creep through the blinds, Jack looked up from his laptop. His face was grim. "I've got something," he said. "But you're not going to like it." David and the others sat up immediately, their eyes fixed on Jack as he slid a printout across the table. It was a list of names, important ones. And among them was a name David never thought he'd see. "What is this?" Emily asked, leaning over to read the document. Jack cleared his throat. "These are some of the key players in the underground operations happening here. I don't know all the details yet, but this," he tapped the name, Hill, on the page, "is a connection to something much bigger. Much more dangerous. And it involves people who have influence in places you wouldn't even imagine. Whoever you've pissed off isn't just some street-level thug. These are powerful people, David." David's heart skipped a beat as his mind tried to process the weight of what Jack was saying. He glanced at Emily, then at Tom, and knew that this wasn't just about survival anymore. They were in the midst of a war, one that was far beyond their control. "We need to figure out how to get ahead of them," David said, his voice barely a whisper. Jack met his gaze, his eyes somber. "And you'd better be prepared for what comes next. You won't like it." The sun had barely risen, casting a pale light through the blinds of the small, dimly lit room. Despite the early hour, the tension in the safe house was palpable. No one slept. David sat near the window, staring out at the empty street beyond, his mind racing. His heart felt heavy, the weight of what Jack had uncovered pressing down on him. This wasn't just about a botched job or a street-level conflict. It was bigger, far bigger. Jack had given them the names of people who were deeply entrenched in the city's underworld, but it was the revelation about Marcus Hill that had really shaken David. Hill's name was linked to several prominent figures, individuals who operated behind closed doors, their influence extending into law enforcement, the government, and even corporate boardrooms. These weren't just criminals, these were the people who ran the city. David's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind him. He turned to see Emily, still in the same clothes from last night, standing in the doorway. Her face was pale, her eyes tired, but her expression was hard. She wasn't someone who broke under pressure, and David had always admired her for that. "Any news?" she asked, crossing the room to join him by the window. David shook his head. "Jack's still working on it. But whatever's coming, it's bad, Emily. We're not just running from street thugs. We're running from people who control everything." Emily's eyes softened. She placed a hand on his shoulder, her touch light but steady. "We'll figure it out. We always do." David wasn't sure he could believe that anymore. He'd always believed that he could solve any problem, handle any challenge, but the stakes had never been this high. If they didn't find a way to turn the tables soon, they would be at the mercy of forces far beyond their control. "What do we do now?" Emily asked, breaking his train of thought. David sighed, rubbing his forehead. "I don't know. We need more information, but we can't trust anyone. We need to find Hill and get him to talk. He's the key to everything." At that moment, Jack appeared from the back room, his face grim. "I've got more," he said, his voice low. "But it's not good." David turned to face him. "What is it?" Jack didn't waste any time. "I dug deeper into Hill's connections. Turns out, he's not just tied to some low-level crime bosses. He's linked to a global network. We're talking serious players here, people who deal in weapons, drugs, human trafficking. The kind of people who will stop at nothing to protect their interests." David's stomach twisted. It was worse than he had feared. This wasn't just about clearing their names anymore, it was about survival. The people they were up against weren't just criminals, they were powerful, ruthless, and they had the resources to make anyone disappear. "And those names you gave me?" David asked. "Are they all in this together?" Jack nodded slowly. Yes. They're part of a much bigger syndicate, with tentacles reaching into politics, business, even law enforcement. They have eyes everywhere, David. And Hill, he's not just some pawn in the game. He's deeply involved. He knows everything. David clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. We need to find him. Now. Jack held up a hand. Hold on. There's more. I found something else. Hill's been hiding something, something big. And I'm not sure if it's a secret they'll let him keep for long. David's mind raced, the possibilities swirling in his head. What are you talking about? Jack looked at him seriously. I've found an address, an old warehouse on the outskirts of the city. It's marked as abandoned, but I have a feeling that's where Hill's been hiding out. If we're lucky, we'll find him there. Emily's eyes lit up with determination. Then that's where we need to go. David nodded. Right. We'll head there as soon as possible. But we need to be careful. These people don't play by the rules. They'll be watching us. They didn't waste any time. The plan was simple: get to the warehouse, find Hill, and get the information they needed. It was dangerous, but it was their only option. As the trio prepared to leave the safe house, David felt the weight of the situation pressing down on him. They were no longer just trying to stay one step ahead of danger, they were on a collision course with something far bigger than any of them could have imagined. They climbed into the SUV, with David behind the wheel, Tom sitting shotgun, and Emily in the back. The silence was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension of knowing they were about to walk into the lion's den. David's grip tightened on the wheel as they drove through the city, the streets now eerily quiet in the early hours of the morning. The sun had fully risen now, but it felt like the calm before the storm, as though the city itself was holding its breath. They reached the outskirts of the city, and the buildings began to thin out. The road they were on grew rougher, the asphalt cracked and faded, and the streetlights fewer and farther between. The warehouse Jack had mentioned loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the pale sky. David slowed the SUV as they approached. He could feel his heartbeat picking up, his palms sweating. Everything about this place screamed danger. Stay alert, David muttered, his eyes scanning the area around them. This could be a trap. They parked a few hundred yards away, out of sight, and climbed out of the SUV, moving quickly but quietly toward the warehouse. The building was large, old, and appeared abandoned, but David had learned not to trust appearances. As they crept toward the entrance, Emily spoke in a hushed voice. Are we sure about this? This could be a setup. David paused, looking at her. We don't have a choice. If Hill's here, we have to find him. We need answers. They reached the door, which was slightly ajar. David pushed it open slowly, the creak of the hinges breaking the silence. The interior of the warehouse was dark, the air thick with dust. As they stepped inside, their footsteps echoed on the concrete floor, the sound unnatural in the empty space. David's hand instinctively went to the gun at his side, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. The last thing he wanted was a firefight in a place like this. Stay close, he whispered, signaling to Emily and Tom to follow him. They moved deeper into the warehouse, the shadows growing thicker with every step. There was a faint smell of oil and rust, and the air felt heavy, as though it had been untouched for years. They moved cautiously, checking every corner and every doorway. The place was eerily quiet, and the sense of danger was palpable. It was like they were being drawn into the lion's den, and David couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Then, in the distance, David saw a figure. A tall man, standing motionless in the shadows. David's pulse quickened. This was it. The figure standing in the shadows was tall, his posture rigid and still, as though he were waiting for something, or someone. The dim light in the warehouse barely illuminated his features, but David could tell the man wasn't alone. He could feel it in the air, the weight of something threatening, something just beyond his reach. David signaled to Emily and Tom to stay back as he took a step forward, the creaking of his boots on the concrete floor sounding unnaturally loud in the otherwise silent space. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to be cautious, but there was no turning back now. This was the moment they'd been heading toward for days, and the truth, however dangerous, had to come out. The man in the shadows didn't move when David stopped a few feet away, and for a tense moment, all that could be heard was the soft hum of distant machinery. The silence felt suffocating. David's voice broke the stillness. "Hill," he called out, trying to keep his tone steady despite the unease clawing at him. The man didn't respond at first, and David's grip tightened on the gun at his side, though he didn't draw it. He was trying to stay calm, trying to think clearly. Finally, the figure stepped forward, revealing a tall, broad-shouldered man dressed in dark clothes. His face was partially obscured by the shadows, but there was no mistaking the cold, calculating look in his eyes. This was a man who had seen too much, done too much, and had no intentions of backing down. David didn't need to see more to know that this man was dangerous. "You have no business here," the figure said, his voice low and rough, like gravel scraping over metal. The words were laced with a threat, the kind that made the hairs on the back of David's neck stand up. David didn't flinch. "I think I do," he said firmly. "I need answers. And I think you're the one who has them." The man's lips curled into a grim smile, though there was nothing warm or welcoming about it. "Answers, huh? You really think you'll get those from me?" David took a step forward, closing the distance. "I know you're tied to something big, Hill. Something powerful. And I want to know what it is. You're not just some middleman. You're involved in something much worse than you've let on. And I want to know how deep this goes." The man's eyes narrowed as if sizing David up, weighing his words. Then, without warning, he took a step toward him, his boots clacking sharply on the concrete. "You're in way over your head, kid," Hill said, his voice low and dangerous. "And I'm not the one you should be worried about. There are bigger fish than me, much bigger." David felt the weight of Hill's words sink into him, but he didn't back down. "Who?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the tension mounting in the air. Hill paused, his gaze flicking to the sides of the warehouse as if making sure no one else was around to overhear. He leaned in closer to David, his voice dropping to a whisper. "If you think this is just about power, you're wrong. This isn't some game. These people, they don't play by your rules. They'll do anything to get what they want. And they don't leave loose ends." David's heart hammered in his chest as the meaning behind Hill's words hit him. Whoever was behind this, whoever Hill was working for, wasn't just dangerous. They were untouchable. "Who are they?" Emily spoke up from behind David, her voice sharp with the same urgency that David was feeling. She stepped forward, keeping a cautious distance but still very much present in the conversation. Hill turned his cold eyes to her, and for a brief moment, it seemed like he was considering his response. Then he sighed, the sound low and resigned. "You don't want to know," he said. "But I guess you've already figured out that this is bigger than you think." David's frustration boiled over. "I'm done playing games. I need to know. Who's pulling the strings?" Hill's expression tightened, and he stepped back, crossing his arms. "This isn't something you can just walk away from," he warned. "The people you're dealing with have connections that stretch far and wide, across governments, corporations, and law enforcement. They own the city, and anyone who tries to cross them ends up in a hole somewhere." David's pulse quickened, and he looked over at Emily and Tom, both of them exchanging glances of concern. The realization was sinking in. This wasn't just about surviving the next few days, this was about exposing a system so deeply entrenched that it would take everything they had to even begin to untangle it. "I'm not backing down," David said firmly, meeting Hill's gaze. "We're not afraid of them. We've already been dragged into this. You don't get to walk away from the mess you've made." Hill seemed to consider this for a moment, his eyes cold but calculating. Then, he let out a short laugh. You think you're the only ones they've been watching? He asked, his voice taking on an edge of bitterness. You think you're the first ones to try and take them down? This is bigger than you can handle. Trust me, kid, you've just stepped into a war you're not ready for. David's anger flared. I'm not afraid of a fight, he spat. Hill's smile widened, but it wasn't a friendly smile, it was cold, mocking. You should be. Because this fight isn't just about you. You're not just up against me, you're up against everyone who makes this city run. And if you think for 1 second that they won't crush you like a bug. David stepped forward, feeling a surge of defiance. We've already started this. You're not getting out of it. You tell us everything you know, or this is going to get a whole lot worse for you. Hill's expression darkened, and for a moment, it seemed like he might lash out. But then, just as quickly, the tension in his shoulders relaxed, and he took a deep breath. All right, Hill said, his voice resigned. You want answers? I'll give them to you. But don't say I didn't warn you. David felt a surge of hope. They were finally getting somewhere. Hill turned and gestured toward the far corner of the warehouse, where a metal door was slightly ajar, revealing a darkened room beyond. Come on, he said, his voice flat. We're going to need to talk in private. Without waiting for a response, Hill began to walk toward the door. David exchanged a look with Emily and Tom before following him. The air in the warehouse felt heavier now, laden with the promise of danger. Every step they took brought them closer to a truth that could change everything. As they entered the dark room, Hill turned to face them, his eyes hard. You want to know who's behind this? I'm going to tell you. But be ready. Because once you know, there's no turning back. David nodded, his jaw set with resolve. We're ready. Hill's eyes flickered with something akin to regret, but he didn't back down. Then get comfortable. You're going to need it. The room was dark, its air thick with the scent of rust and dust. The only sound was the low hum of machinery far off in the distance, as if the warehouse itself was holding its breath. David, Emily, and Tom stood in a tight circle, their bodies tense, eyes fixed on Hill. The truth was moments away, and it felt as though everything in their lives was about to shatter, or maybe finally fall into place. Hill stood across from them, his face illuminated by the faint light from the room's single bulb hanging from the ceiling. There was something different about him now, a quiet intensity, almost as if he had resigned himself to whatever was coming. His shoulders were stiff, and his jaw clenched as if he was preparing himself for what was to come. David's heart raced. Who are they, Hill? His voice was sharp, urgent. There was no room for hesitation now. The truth could be their salvation or their downfall. Hill exhaled slowly, his eyes momentarily flicking to the ground as though gathering his thoughts. When he spoke, it was almost like he was speaking to himself. You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you? David's impatience flared. Stop playing games. We don't have time for this. Hill's eyes narrowed, then he gave a short, bitter laugh. Fine. You want the truth. You're not just dealing with a criminal syndicate or some rogue faction. You're up against the most powerful people in the city, people who pull the strings behind everything you've ever known. They own this city, every corner of it. They control the law, the businesses, even the media. And they're not just local players, David. They're international. The words hit David like a punch to the gut. He had suspected the depth of the conspiracy, but this? This was bigger than anything he had imagined. His mind raced, trying to process what Hill had just laid out for him. You're talking about a global network? Emily asked, her voice sharp with disbelief. Who are these people? What's their endgame? Hill met her gaze. Their endgame? Control. Absolute control. They've been building this empire for decades, using every tool at their disposal. Politics, business, technology, they have their hands in it all. And anyone who stands in their way? Well, they get dealt with. Quietly. Discreetly. David's stomach turned. And you're a part of this? Hill didn't flinch. I wasn't always. I didn't choose this. But once you're in, there's no getting out. You either play by their rules or you disappear. Tom stepped forward, his eyes burning with anger. So you're telling us we've been fighting against some global conspiracy this whole time? All the deaths, all the danger, it's all connected to these people. Hill nodded slowly. Yes. You've been used, just like everyone else who crosses their path. And now you've made yourselves a target. Congratulations. David's blood ran cold. The implications of Hill's words were staggering. For weeks, they had been chasing shadows, trying to clear their names, uncover the truth. But this was something far darker than a corrupt judge or a small-time drug dealer. This was a system so deeply ingrained that it seemed impossible to take down. What's their name? David asked, his voice barely a whisper. He had to know. He had to understand who they were up against. Who are they? Hill hesitated, his gaze flicking around the room as though he was considering whether or not to say it. Finally, his lips parted, and he said one word. The Syndicate. The word hung in the air, thick with menace. David could feel his chest tightening, his mind reeling. The Syndicate. A name that sounded like a whisper in a dark corner, a shadow that reached into every part of their world. But who were they? What did they want? Before David could speak again, Hill continued, his voice almost somber now. The Syndicate isn't just a criminal organization. It's a network of elites, people who own everything. They've been operating for years, shaping governments, controlling markets, pulling strings in every corner of society. They don't want money, they want power. They want to control the world. David could barely comprehend what Hill was saying. This wasn't just about surviving, they were in the middle of a battle for the very control of society itself. Everything David had thought he knew about power, about justice, was suddenly called into question. Where do we fit into all of this? Emily asked, her voice strained but steady. Why us? Hill looked at her, his expression momentarily softening. You got caught up in this because you stumbled on something you weren't supposed to. The judge, the one who sentenced you, was part of the game. And now they're making sure you're either part of it, or you're gone. David felt his mind racing, piecing together the fragments of information Hill had given them. The judge, the corrupt legal system, the twisted alliances between people they had trusted, everything pointed to one undeniable fact: they were not just fighting for their freedom. They were fighting for their lives. And how do we stop them? Tom's voice was low but full of determination. How do we bring down an empire like that? Hill's eyes flickered with something akin to respect, but his expression quickly hardened. You don't stop them. Not without a massive price. The Syndicate doesn't fall, not without a war. A war that could take down everything. They have resources, connections. And they know how to make people disappear. David's stomach twisted again. He had always thought of fighting as a way to protect the weak, to expose the corrupt. But this was a different kind of battle. This wasn't just about justice. It was about survival. We don't have a choice, David said, his voice firm despite the fear that was creeping into his chest. If we don't do something now, they'll crush us. And everyone else who gets in their way. Hill's lips curled into a thin smile. You think you're ready? You have no idea what you're up against. But then again, I guess you don't have much of a choice, do you? David clenched his fists, feeling the weight of the decision settling over him. There was no turning back now. They were in this, whether they were ready or not. Tell us what to do, Emily said, her tone unwavering. We'll do whatever it takes. Hill sighed, his eyes flicking toward the door behind them. There's a safe house. I've been in touch with someone who can help you, someone on the inside. But it's risky. You won't be safe there for long. The syndicate has eyes everywhere. But if you're smart, you'll find out what you need to know. David nodded, his mind already shifting into overdrive. He had to think ahead, plan their next move. They were on the edge now, one wrong step, and they would fall into the abyss. Let's go, he said, turning toward the door. We don't have time to waste. As they left the dark room, the weight of the future settled over them. They weren't just fighting for their freedom anymore. They were fighting for the future itself. And the stakes had never been higher. The safe house was hidden in plain sight, nestled between two aging brick buildings on a quiet street. The sort of place people would walk by without ever giving it a second thought. That was the point, wasn't it? People like David, Emily, and Tom would never expect it to be anything more than just another abandoned property. As they approached the front door, David felt a strange mix of anticipation and dread. The syndicate's reach was vast, and no matter how careful they were, they knew the danger wasn't over. If anything, it was just beginning. Hill had been right about one thing: they couldn't trust anyone outside their immediate circle. Even within their group, there were moments of uncertainty. Who could really be trusted? Was Hill leading them into an even deeper trap? David shook off the thoughts, pushing open the creaky door. The hinges groaned, a sound that echoed in the silence, and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit, with a faint smell of mildew in the air. It felt like a place that had been forgotten by time, a refuge in a city that had long since abandoned hope. Stay close, David said, his voice low and cautious. We don't know who we're dealing with here. Hill said someone would meet us, but we need to be ready for anything. Emily nodded, her hand resting on the sidearm she carried beneath her jacket. Tom was already checking the surroundings, scanning for exits or any signs that they were being watched. The room they entered looked like a typical safe house: bare walls, minimal furniture, and no windows. There were a few chairs arranged around a small table in the center of the room, with maps and documents scattered across it. It wasn't much, but in the current situation, it was enough. David's eyes quickly scanned the papers, trying to make sense of what they were looking at. The notes were full of cryptic references to the syndicate's operations, a fragmented puzzle that needed piecing together. As they set their bags down, a soft click sounded from behind them, followed by a faint rustling sound. David's heart skipped a beat as he turned around. Standing in the doorway was a figure clad in dark clothes, a woman, her features hidden beneath the shadow of her hood. You're the ones who've been making noise, aren't you? The woman's voice was smooth, controlled, but there was an edge to it. She wasn't surprised to see them. If anything, she seemed like she'd been expecting them. David didn't move immediately, assessing the situation. There was something about this woman that didn't feel right, like she was more than just an informant. Who are you? Emily asked, her tone sharp and direct. The woman stepped forward, lowering her hood to reveal sharp features and piercing eyes. She had a cold, almost regal presence. You can call me Sarah, she said, crossing her arms. And I think it's time we have a little chat. David exchanged a look with Emily and Tom, but all three knew they had little choice. They needed answers, and Sarah might be their only link to them. You said you could help us, David said, his voice measured. We need to know how deep this goes. What we're dealing with. Who's pulling the strings? Sarah raised an eyebrow. You've already figured that out, haven't you? The syndicate. Global reach. Endless power. David nodded slowly. We know about them. What we don't know is how to stop them. Sarah's lips curled into a small smile, though there was no humor in it. You don't stop them. Not the way you think. David's frustration flared. We didn't come here for riddles. If you know something, tell us. She held up her hands, signaling for calm. I'm not here to play games. I'm here to give you what you need to know. But understand this isn't just about taking down a few bad guys. This is about a system that's built on centuries of manipulation and control. What the syndicate is doing isn't new, it's just more refined, more dangerous. David felt his stomach churn. So, what's the plan? How do we fight back? Sarah walked over to the table, picking up a stack of papers. She sorted through them methodically, her eyes scanning the contents before she spoke again. There's a network, David. The syndicate doesn't work like an army. They're not centralized. They operate through a web of influence. Their power is distributed, each member controls a piece, a specific region or sector. To dismantle them, you have to start small, hit their weak points. David took a step forward, leaning over the table to get a closer look at the documents. These names, he said, pointing to one of the pages. Are these the people we need to target? Sarah glanced at the names before nodding. Yes. These individuals have been identified as key players within the syndicate. They control the money, the supply chains, the media. But even if you take them down, the syndicate won't fall. Not yet. Tom scowled. So, what's the point? We go after the low-level operatives, and that's it? Sarah's gaze hardened. You'll need to do more than just go after them. You need to expose them. Tear down the entire network, piece by piece. It won't be easy, and it won't be quick. But it's the only way you'll have a chance. David's thoughts raced. He could feel the weight of the challenge settling on his shoulders. This wasn't a battle that could be won in a few days, or even weeks. It would take everything they had. Why are you helping us? Emily asked, her voice cautious. What's in it for you? Sarah's expression softened, but just barely. Because I've been where you are. I know what it's like to fight against a system that wants to crush you. But I also know how dangerous it is to go up against them without knowing how deep they're embedded. I've spent years watching them, studying their moves. And I've made a lot of enemies along the way. If you want to survive, you're going to need more than just guts. You're going to need a plan. David nodded slowly, his mind processing the new information. They were in this for the long haul now, and he couldn't afford to make any mistakes. Then help us, David said. Give us the tools, the resources we need to do this right. Sarah met his gaze, her expression unreadable. I can give you the resources, but you'll have to do the rest. I'll make sure you have everything you need to start. But remember, there's no turning back once you begin. If you want to take them down, you're going to have to be willing to pay the price. The weight of her words settled over him like a cloud. David knew what they were getting into. The stakes were higher than anything he'd ever faced. The road ahead would be dangerous, fraught with traps and betrayals. But they had no choice. They were already in the game. The air in the safe house had grown thick with tension as the group sat around the table, staring at the map and documents spread out before them. David's mind was racing, his thoughts a jumble of plans, questions, and doubts. Everything Sarah had told them was overwhelming, but there was no time to dwell on the enormity of the task ahead. They had a job to do, and it started now. I can't believe this is real, Tom said, leaning back in his chair, arms crossed. His eyes were wide with disbelief as he looked over the names on the list Sarah had provided. This isn't just some underground criminal ring. This is an entire web of power that's infected every part of society. Emily was silent for a moment, her gaze fixed on the map of the city spread across the table. The locations marked in red ink were a mix of high-end real estate, government buildings, and corporate headquarters, places that looked normal on the surface but were all connected to the syndicate. Who are we even supposed to start with? Emily asked, breaking the silence. These people, these places, they all look like high-risk targets. David felt the weight of her words. The names were heavy, like chains waiting to pull them under. Each one represented someone with enough power to ruin their lives, and each was deeply embedded in a system that seemed impossible to dismantle. Sarah, standing off to the side, spoke up. The syndicate's grip is like a cancer. It doesn't have one head, it has many. But there's one thing they all need: money. You hit them where it hurts the most, by attacking their financial empire. David glanced at the pile of documents. Most of them were focused on the financial dealings of various corporations, illicit trades, and shell companies, but one document in particular caught his eye. It was a ledger, with a list of transactions so cryptic that it made his head spin. This wasn't just about blackmail or bribes, it was about control on a massive scale. "We need to hit their money," David said, his voice firm as he folded the document. "But we can't do it alone. We need allies, people who have access to their networks, who can help us move the pieces into place without drawing attention." Sarah nodded. "That's where I come in. I have a contact, a hacker, someone who can get into their systems and find out where the money is being funneled. But you'll need to move quickly. The syndicate has eyes everywhere. They'll notice if anything unusual happens." "Do you trust this hacker?" Emily asked, her voice skeptical. Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. "I've worked with him before. He's good, but he's also unpredictable. I wouldn't trust him with my life, but I don't have much of a choice." David weighed her words carefully. "If he's unpredictable, what's to stop him from turning on us?" "He won't," Sarah replied, her tone hardening. "He owes me. And I always make sure people pay their debts." The conversation fell into a heavy silence. David was starting to realize just how far they'd stepped into a world that was more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. There were no guarantees in this fight, no safety nets. But at this point, what choice did they have? "We'll meet him tonight," Sarah said, breaking the silence. "I've already arranged it. He'll be waiting at an old parking garage on the outskirts of the city. From there, we'll figure out our next move." David nodded, making the decision without hesitation. "Let's go." The city outside the safe house was a world of contradictions. It had the polished sheen of modernity, but beneath it, David could feel the rot, the secrets, the lies, the corruption that festered just beneath the surface. As they drove through the streets, the weight of their mission felt heavier with every turn. The garage they were headed to was located in a part of the city that had been forgotten by time. It was run down, abandoned cars stacked in corners like discarded toys. The flickering streetlights gave the area an eerie, almost abandoned vibe, the kind of place where you could disappear without a trace. David felt his pulse quicken as the car pulled into the dimly lit garage. They parked near the back, where the shadows were thick. Tom's hand was resting near his sidearm, his eyes scanning the surroundings as they stepped out of the car. "Stay alert," David muttered under his breath. Sarah led the way, moving swiftly and silently through the garage. The faint sound of their footsteps echoed in the emptiness. As they reached the far corner of the garage, a figure emerged from the shadows, a man, dressed in a long coat, with a beanie pulled low over his eyes. His face was partially obscured by a pair of dark sunglasses, despite the lack of sunlight. "You're late," the man said, his voice flat, almost bored. "We had to make sure we weren't followed," Sarah replied, her voice tense but controlled. The man gave her a short, sharp nod and then turned his gaze to the others. His eyes lingered on David for a moment, studying him as if he were trying to figure out what kind of man he was. "This is the team?" the hacker asked, his voice carrying an air of disdain. "I thought we were dealing with professionals, not a bunch of amateurs." David stepped forward, his gaze hard. "You're here to help us, not judge us. Are you in or out?" The hacker seemed to consider this for a moment before giving a short laugh. "You're lucky Sarah's got a hold on me. I don't normally do favors for people I don't like." Sarah shot him a sharp look. "Enough talk. We need the access codes to their financial system. Can you get them?" The hacker smirked. "Can I? I can do more than that. I can give you everything, their accounts, their transactions, their shell companies. Everything you need to bring this house of cards down." David felt a flicker of hope, but he didn't let it show. This could be the break they needed. The hacker was dangerous, unpredictable, but if he was as good as Sarah claimed, he could give them the tools to make the syndicate pay. "We'll need to move quickly," David said, his voice steady. "We have no idea how much time we have before they notice we're onto them." The hacker glanced over his shoulder, checking the shadows before pulling a laptop from his bag. "Don't worry. I'll be in and out before they even know what hit them. But once I crack their systems, there's no going back." "You're all in?" David nodded. "We're ready." As the hacker plugged in the laptop and began typing rapidly, David's mind raced. The walls were closing in, but for the first time in what felt like forever, he had a sliver of hope. This was the beginning of something much larger than just a fight for survival. It was a chance to make the syndicate bleed, to take back control of their lives. But even as he watched the hacker work, David knew they were walking a razor's edge. The storm was gathering, and it was only a matter of time before the syndicate struck back. The air in the parking garage felt thick, as though it were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. David couldn't shake the feeling that they were on the edge of something monumental, and it was impossible to know whether it would end in triumph or disaster. The hacker, whose name turned out to be Vincent, worked quickly and with an intensity that was both unsettling and impressive. His fingers flew over the keyboard of his laptop, the clicking of the keys loud in the otherwise silent space. The glow of the screen illuminated his face, casting sharp shadows across his sharp features. "Almost there," Vincent muttered under his breath, his eyes never leaving the screen. David, Emily, and Tom stood a few feet away, keeping a watchful eye on their surroundings. They had all agreed on one thing: they couldn't afford to let their guard down, not for a second. The last thing they needed was the syndicate's enforcers swooping in on them in the middle of a hack. "How long is this going to take?" Tom asked, his voice low but impatient. "Patience," Emily replied, her voice calm but sharp. "We're not going to rush him." Vincent shot them both a quick, almost dismissive glance. "I don't need your moral support. I need silence. You'll know when it's done." David had never been particularly fond of the hacker's arrogance, but right now, he had little choice but to let it slide. This was their best shot at getting the information they needed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Vincent's fingers stilled. The screen flickered for a moment before displaying a series of encrypted files. "Done," Vincent said, leaning back in his chair and rubbing his hands together. His voice was more relaxed now, but still laced with an air of superiority. "Everything you need to bring down the syndicate is right here." David stepped forward, his pulse quickening. The laptop was now displaying a series of documents that were far beyond what they had hoped for: financial transactions, names, and locations, all linked to the syndicate's global operation. But it wasn't just the details of their illicit dealings that had David's heart racing. It was the realization of how vast and interconnected everything was. These weren't just small-time criminals, they were controlling entire industries, manipulating governments, and weaving an intricate web of influence that spanned continents. "Is this all of it?" Emily asked, leaning over to get a better look at the screen. Vincent clicked a few more buttons, pulling up more files. "Everything. They don't know I'm in yet. But trust me, these people are sloppy. They leave a trail, and I've followed it. The money, the power, the people, this is all the syndicate. This is where it all comes together." David studied the files closely. There were codes, numbers, and addresses scattered across the screen, but the deeper he looked, the more he realized the enormity of what they were facing. The syndicate had its fingers in every conceivable industry: pharmaceuticals, oil, tech, transportation, and even law enforcement. They controlled key political figures, judges, and law firms. The deeper they dug, the more it became clear that this wasn't just about fighting a criminal organization, it was about dismantling a shadow empire that had woven itself so deeply into the fabric of society that cutting it out would leave a gaping hole. "This is bigger than we thought," David muttered under his breath. His heart raced as the weight of the situation settled in. "Tell me something I don't know," Tom replied. His voice was tinged with disbelief, but there was an edge of determination in it. "So, now what?" David turned back to Vincent, his mind running a mile a minute. "We need to expose this. But we need a plan, something that won't make us all targets immediately." Vincent leaned forward, a mischievous glint in his eyes. "You want to bring them down. You don't just leak files. You hit them where it hurts. Get their secrets out into the world, make it public. Take away their power." David's thoughts turned to the media, the one force capable of revealing the truth to the masses. But how could they possibly make such a massive shift without being discovered first? How could they ensure the files were safe? "We need a journalist," Emily said suddenly. "Someone who can write about this without looking over their shoulder every time they hit send." David looked at her with a mixture of surprise and agreement. "We can't just send this out in a few random emails. We need someone with credibility, someone who can bring attention to this and make sure it sticks." "That's where I come in," Sarah's voice cut through the tension. She had been standing at the back, silently observing the exchange. "I know a reporter. She's been investigating the syndicate for years. She's cautious, but if we give her the right proof, she'll run with it." David looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Are you sure we can trust her?" Sarah hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "As sure as I can be. She's played the game longer than we have. She'll help us. But it's risky. If the syndicate catches wind of what we're doing, they'll retaliate. Hard. Then we move fast," David said, his voice steady. "We expose them to the world. We hit them with everything we've got, and we don't give them time to cover it up." Vincent closed his laptop with a snap, his expression suddenly more serious. "You think the syndicate's going to let you waltz in and ruin everything they've built? They're going to come for you. All of you." David met his gaze without flinching. "I know. But we don't have a choice. This ends now." The drive to the reporter's location was tense, each of them lost in their own thoughts, preparing for what they were about to do. The city was a blur as David's mind ran through the possible outcomes of what was about to happen. They were about to take the biggest risk of their lives, and there was no turning back. They arrived at a small cafe in the heart of the city. The kind of place where people could blend in, discreet, anonymous. The woman they were meeting with, a journalist named Claire, was already inside, sitting at a corner booth, her laptop open in front of her. David stepped inside first, followed by Emily and Tom. Sarah took up the rear, scanning the room for any signs of danger. As they approached the booth, Claire looked up, her eyes sharp but not unkind. "You have the information?" she asked, her voice low. David nodded, pulling the files from his bag and placing them on the table in front of her. "We have everything you need. But we need you to act fast. The syndicate will be onto us the moment this goes public." Claire's fingers hovered over the papers, her expression unreadable. After a moment, she closed her laptop and looked up at them. "This is huge," she said. "If this is legitimate, this will change everything. But it's not just about the story. It's about the people who will be trying to stop it." David leaned in, his voice firm. "We know the risks. But we're ready to take them. Are you?" Claire met his gaze with a steady look. "I'll write the story. But you need to be prepared for the fallout. The syndicate won't go down without a fight." David knew that the storm was coming. But for the first time in what felt like forever, he could see the path forward. It was dangerous, it was uncertain, but it was a chance to bring the truth to light. To finally take down the syndicate. The moment the first article went live, the world shifted. It started with a single headline, a whisper in the vast sea of online media. But that whisper grew louder. Much louder. The syndicate uncovered how a global criminal empire infiltrated politics, business, and law, the title flashed across every news platform, every social media feed, sending shockwaves throughout the city. David sat in the dimly lit safe house, his heart hammering in his chest as the notifications flooded in. The first wave of media outlets began to pick up Claire's article, each one amplifying the revelations. Every detail, every transaction, every name, laid bare for the world to see. The syndicate, for years hidden in the shadows, was now exposed in the harsh light of day. But even as they celebrated their small victory, David could feel the storm gathering on the horizon. "They're going to come for us," Emily muttered, staring at her phone. Her fingers scrolled through the deluge of social media posts, some praising their bravery, others mocking them for daring to take on the syndicate. "It's only a matter of time before they find us." Tom stood by the window, scanning the street below through the cracked blinds. His eyes were sharp, his posture tense. "We've been over this. We keep moving, stay under the radar. We don't stop now." David leaned back against the table, rubbing his eyes as exhaustion began to settle in. He hadn't slept in days, his mind racing from one plan to the next, each more risky than the last. They had made it this far, but the fight was only just beginning. "The world knows now," he said quietly. "But it's going to take more than an article to bring them down. They've got the resources, the power. They'll fight back, and we need to be ready." Sarah, who had been silent for the last hour, finally spoke up. Her voice was steady, but there was a coldness to it that David hadn't heard before. "We need to disappear." David turned to her, confusion clouding his thoughts. "What are you talking about?" "They'll come after us. All of us. If they haven't already figured out who we are, they will soon. We can't just keep running around, hoping for the best." "So, what do you suggest?" David asked. "We just hide." "Yes," Sarah replied, her gaze unwavering. "We lay low. Keep moving, change our identities if we have to. We stay off the grid until the heat dies down. The syndicate is big, but it's not invincible. They'll make mistakes. And when they do, that's when we strike again." David frowned. The idea of running, hiding, felt like defeat. But deep down, he knew she was right. The world was watching, and as much as they wanted to push forward, they couldn't afford to make careless mistakes. If they wanted to bring down the syndicate once and for all, they needed to stay alive first. He let out a long breath. "Fine. We hide. But we don't stop. Not until this is over." The next few days felt like a blur of moving, staying one step ahead of whatever might be coming for them. They relocated from the safe house to a series of temporary locations, an old cabin in the woods, a small motel on the outskirts of town, and finally, a nondescript apartment in a different part of the city. Vincent had been right, the syndicate's retaliation was swift. They had infiltrated law enforcement, political circles, and corporate institutions for years, and now they were using every resource at their disposal to track down the people behind the leaks. It didn't take long before the first reports surfaced. People who had helped with the article, who had been too close to the truth, had disappeared. But David, Emily, Tom, and Sarah kept moving, carefully. They knew the syndicate wouldn't stop until they had erased every trace of their operation. The safe houses, the new identities, it all felt temporary, like a fragile barrier against a tidal wave that was inevitably going to crash over them. One evening, as they gathered in the dingy apartment, Emily's voice broke the tense silence. "David," she said, her tone strained. "Look at this." She showed him her phone. A news report flashed on the screen, showing the face of a man who had been one of the syndicate's enforcers. His body had been found in an alley, brutally beaten and left for dead. His expression was unrecognizable, his injuries severe. But what made David's blood run cold was the message scrawled on a nearby wall in red paint: "This is what happens to traitors." David felt the room freeze. This wasn't just a warning, it was a message. The syndicate wasn't going to let them get away with exposing their secrets. They were sending a clear signal to anyone involved in their downfall: we will find you, and we will destroy you. They're not going to stop until they've wiped us out, David muttered. We've poked the hornet's nest, and now we're going to feel the sting. We need to move, Tom said, his voice clipped. If they're targeting people involved in the article, then it's only a matter of time before they come for us. We're not safe here. But Sarah, as usual, was calm. This is the moment we've been waiting for. They're scared now. They're making mistakes, getting sloppy. We just need to keep them on the defensive. We need to keep pushing. David stared at her for a long moment. He had always trusted Sarah's instincts, but this was different. They were playing with fire now, and the consequences could be catastrophic. Still, he couldn't deny the truth in her words. If they stopped now, the syndicate would win. I'm in, David said, his voice steady despite the tension that gripped his chest. We keep fighting. We expose more, we take more ground. But we do it smarter. No more mistakes. I agree, Emily added, determination in her eyes. If we let them scare us, they win. For the first time in days, David felt something like resolve settling in. The road ahead was dangerous, more dangerous than anything they had faced so far. But this was the final stretch. They couldn't stop now, not when they were so close. They weren't just fighting to take down a criminal organization. They were fighting for the truth. For justice. And that was a fight worth dying for. Later that night, as they were planning their next move, an unexpected knock came at the door. Everyone froze. No one was supposed to know where they were. They had been careful. Too careful to be found now. David motioned for the others to stay quiet, then slowly moved toward the door. He checked the peephole, his breath catching in his throat when he saw who was standing on the other side. It was Claire. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide with fear. They're coming for me, she whispered as soon as David opened the door. They know who I am. David stepped aside, allowing her inside. What happened? I've been followed for days, she said, glancing nervously over her shoulder. The syndicate, they've been making calls, tracing my movements. They know I'm the one who wrote the article. And now they're going to make an example of me. David's mind raced. They couldn't afford to lose her, not now, not when they were so close to breaking the story wide open. We need to get you out of here, David said. Now. But Claire shook her head, tears welling up in her eyes. It's too late. They're already here. The storm was finally upon them. The tension in the room was palpable. Every second felt like an eternity as the sounds of muffled footsteps echoed from the hallway outside. David's mind raced, trying to think of a way out. The syndicate was closing in, and Claire's presence in the apartment had just made them a target. They couldn't afford to let their enemies find them now, not when they were so close to ending it all. Think, David muttered under his breath, pacing the small apartment. He could hear the others moving behind him, quietly discussing their options. But none of them knew what to do next. The syndicate's reach had stretched so far, they could be watching every street corner, every exit. And the fact that Claire had been followed meant they had little time to act. We can't stay here, Emily said, her voice tight with fear but controlled. They'll find us if we stay. We have to move. David nodded, his mind still working through every scenario. He glanced at Claire, who was sitting on the couch, her face pale and drawn, hands trembling. She looked as though she had been through a storm already, and now, it seemed, she was caught in the center of another one. I know, he said, his voice firm. But we need to stay ahead of them. If they're already onto Claire, we have to get her out of here and into hiding. It's our only shot at keeping this fight alive. There was a silence as they all took in the gravity of the situation. Vincent was pacing as well, occasionally stopping to type something on his phone. His usual cocky demeanor was gone, replaced by the same look of urgency they all shared. Tom was near the window, scanning the streets below again, watching for any sign of movement. But then, Sarah, always the calmest of the group, spoke up. "We don't run. Not this time." David stopped dead in his tracks and turned to her, surprised. "What do you mean?" "We've been running for too long," she said, her tone steady but resolute. "Every time we get a lead, every time we make a breakthrough, we're always moving. We can't keep running. We've come too far." "Are you suggesting we stand and fight?" Tom asked incredulously, his eyes wide. "The syndicate is everywhere, Sarah. You really want to face them head-on?" Sarah's gaze didn't waver. "Yes, we do. They think they've won. They think they've intimidated us into silence. But we've got something they don't have, the truth. We've already exposed them, and it's only a matter of time before it gets bigger. We need to finish what we started." David's heart pounded in his chest. Sarah was right, they couldn't keep running forever. And hiding Claire away in some random location would only delay the inevitable. The syndicate would eventually find her, find all of them. "We fight," David said, his voice growing stronger as he made his decision. "We take this fight to them. We make them feel the weight of their crimes. We expose every single person involved in this, until there's nowhere left for them to hide." The room fell silent again. Claire, her face a mixture of fear and gratitude, looked at him. "You're sure about this?" David nodded, his eyes steely with determination. "We've come too far to back down now. We finish this." The plan was risky, extremely risky, but it was the only option left. They would not run, not hide. Instead, they would take the fight directly to the syndicate, exposing them in ways they couldn't ignore. They would use the information Vincent had uncovered, the encrypted files, the connections, the financial dealings, and use it to build a network of allies, those still fighting for justice, those who could help expose the syndicate's full scope. Vincent had already arranged for the data to be sent to trusted journalists, but it was no longer enough to simply leak information. They needed something bigger, something that would force the hands of those who held the power, the law enforcement, and the media. If the syndicate controlled the narrative, they would continue to evade justice. David knew that the only way to break the cycle was to force the world to confront the truth. "It's going to take everything we have," Emily said, looking around the room. "But we've got the truth, and they can't run from it. Not anymore." They all nodded in agreement. The next 24 hours were a blur of activity. Claire was smuggled to a secure location while the team worked feverishly, coordinating their next steps. The hackers who had been helping them, those who still believed in the cause, were working behind the scenes, ensuring that all the data would be distributed in ways that would not be easily suppressed. They would push the syndicate's darkest secrets into the public eye, forcing governments to act. David took the lead, calling in favors from journalists who were still fighting for truth in a world rife with corruption. He knew that this was the moment that would define everything. If they succeeded, the syndicate would be exposed for the monsters they were. If they failed, they would be nothing more than another set of nameless victims, lost in the shadows. They spent the entire night preparing, setting up multiple secure communication channels and ways to ensure the information would reach the right hands. The final push was set for the following morning, and David felt a weight on his chest. They were about to make a move that would change everything. But there was one more thing they had to do before the storm broke. They had to confront the person at the very top, the one who had orchestrated the entire syndicate from the shadows. The one person whose face was rarely seen but whose influence stretched across continents. The one person who, if taken down, would make the syndicate crumble. Judge Vivian Riker. The woman who had mocked David so cruelly during his trial. The woman whose power, arrogance, and ruthlessness had allowed the syndicate to thrive. She was the key to everything. And they had one final chance to make her pay. David stood outside her mansion, the place that had once seemed so untouchable. It was just past dawn, and the first rays of sunlight were starting to peek over the horizon. But David was not here to admire the view. He was here to make sure that the final blow would land. "Ready?" Emily asked softly, her hand on his shoulder. David nodded. "Let's finish this." They approached the mansion together, silently, their minds focused on the task at hand. Inside, Judge Riker sat at the heart of the syndicate's power, blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to come. The moment David stepped into the building, it was clear that this wasn't just about revenge. It was about justice. The truth was coming for Riker, for the syndicate, for everyone who thought they were untouchable. And there was no turning back now. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?